We are Planet Depots. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices across the nation and around the world, Planet Depots is a 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, one-stop court reporting and litigation technology company. Whatever you need, whenever and wherever you need it, we make it happen.
Trial lawyer's job isn't to know all the nuances, to know what it takes to keep Medicaid in place or SSI and preserve Medicare and comply with the Medicare Secondary Payer Act and resolve these complicated liens that may be present. So all of those issues are issues that the trial lawyer really doesn't have the time or the expertise to deal with. They need a partner that they can rely upon that can handle all of those issues, and that's exactly what Synergy is.
Synergy provides efficient healthcare lien resolution, cutting-edge Medicare secondary payer compliance services, public benefit preservation mechanisms, including pooled special needs trusts and Medicare set-asides, settlement asset management trusts, comprehensive settlement planning and consulting services, tax deferral mechanisms for trial lawyers, qualified settlement fund administration, and mass tort lien resolution services.
At CED, we serve the legal industry as forensic engineers and expert witnesses. We explain the science in your case and base our opinions on standards and engineering. The company was formed 30 plus years ago by a group of Naval Academy professors. We continue to hire staff with engineering disciplines including mechanical, civil, structural, electrical, material science, and biomechanics to answer the injury causation question.
Furthermore, to ensure that all of our experts and their work product meet our high standards, we incorporate various quality controls such as collaboration amongst the engineers, technical review of all of our written work product, and mentorship.
To find out more about our expertise or our informative webinars, visit cedtechnologies.com. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Chuck Thorne, co-managing member of Multi-Specialty Healthcare and proud platinum sponsor of the DC Trial Lawyers. Multi-Specialty is the largest, most experienced multidisciplinary provider of personal injury rehabilitative care services throughout Maryland and Delaware. Multi-Specialty provides high-quality, integrated healthcare to people suffering from neuromusculoskeletal injuries and chronic conditions. We have an extensive slate of office-based diagnostic, surgical, and rehabilitative services, all medically managed from evaluation to completion of treatment. The company has 34 care centers, including an outpatient surgery center, 2 MRI facilities, 2 work rehab and aquatic facilities, and is staffed by 16 medical physicians, including orthopedic surgeons, neurologists, a medical team, and interventional pain management specialists, along with extender providers, as well as 28 doctors of chiropractic who provide a full scope of rehabilitative services, including vestibular and cognitive therapy. The company provides timely and accurate medical records, bills, and value-added documentation throughout its HIPAA-compliant, password-protected attorney portal. We deliver high-quality, cost-effective, and efficient services in an outcome-oriented environment. Visit our website at www.mshclegal.com and schedule a new case at our 24/7 scheduling line at 888-807-2778. And thank you for the opportunity of participating in the care of your injured clients.
As attorneys, paralegals, and case managers, you work long and fight hard to secure the best settlement for your client. But you know there's one major hurdle to overcome before you and your client can receive settlement funds: resolving healthcare liens. A frustrating process that puts your client's settlement at risk and consumes your firm's time and energy. Each lien can cost you hours filling out paperwork, sending faxes and emails, reviewing claims, contacting lien holders, and keeping your client informed. The burden falls directly on you, and the process's lack of transparency can leave you in the dark. But we've changed all that. Introducing LeanDesk. LeanDesk automates the process so you can resolve your client's liens more efficiently. Simply enter your case information and upload the required documents. Tell LeanDesk which healthcare payers to contact. We'll set up a case with any payer that wants to assert a lien against your client's settlement. LeanDesk's proprietary data mining algorithms go to work identifying and flagging claims that aren't related to your client's injuries. LeanDesk keeps you updated throughout the resolution process. And if you decide to go back to the lien holder, our expertise in reduction tactics will help you obtain the best possible outcome for your client. When the liens are finalized, LeanDesk will notify you with the payment due date and the payment instructions. The entire process is managed by Epic's industry-leading lien resolution experts who oversee your cases and are always available to answer your questions. While LeanDesk's world-class security protects your client's data, eliminate your lien resolution headaches and refocus on your clients and your business. Spend less time locked to your desk by using ours. Request a demo today.
At Capital Healthcare and Maryland Healthcare Clinics, we specialize in treating patients who have suffered automobile or work-related injuries. We have more than 60 locations across DC, Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware. We are a full-service facility offering care for each stage of a patient's treatment, including internal medicine, orthopedics, neurology, physiatry, psychiatry, physical therapy, and radiology. At Capital and Maryland Healthcare Clinics, all services are offered in-house, which gives us maximum flexibility to provide the highest quality medical treatments. Our patients' speedy recovery is what keeps us going. Therefore, we strive to make the treatment process easy and effective so that our patients can heal and recover as best as possible. Our attorney portal allows you to schedule same-day appointments, securely access your patient's medical records, HIPAA compliant, exam results, and itemized bills. We are fully open for business and working diligently to keep our patients and staff safe by following all the necessary guidelines recommended by the CDC and government officials. For more information, please contact Nagora at 301-906-6941.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph Gonzalez with Physician Life Care Planning, and I'm speaking to you from Philly, where bad things happen. We're very pleased to continue our sponsorship of the Trial Lawyers Association of Washington, D.C. during these uncertain times. I'm excited to report that during this off-season, Physician Life Care Planning has continued to work on our goal to provide credible, convenient, and high-quality damages valuation services for our clients. This includes adapting our practices to create safe environments for staff, experts, clients, and claimants, creating working relationships with fast funds and fast case support to work seamlessly with attorneys and firms which may need to access working capital for case expenses. We've also added physician life care planners in Maine, Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and Virginia, giving us a nationwide footprint of over 70 associate physician life care planners. This includes the addition of Dr. Albert Jones, located in the Richmond area. We've also added Atlanta-based forensic economist Dr. Nick Volkoff and vocational and rehabilitation specialist Despina Bugiakis of Spark Hill, New York. This will allow us to better serve your medical and related damages valuation services needs. And to close, I want to thank all of our Metro DC clients for your continued trust and support. We truly appreciate all that you do and all of the work that DC TLA does for the legal community and public. Thank you very much.
Does your case have any outstanding medical bills or claims for reimbursement by a lien holder? Are you looking to maximize the settlement funds for your client? At Metavest, we're here to help. We offer a wide variety of lien investigation and resolution services to help protect the settlement funds. We specialize in Medicare, Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, VA and TRICARE, FEBA, ERISA, hospital, and private healthcare liens. Medivest has the knowledge and experience to navigate the complexities of lien resolution. Your time is valuable. Let us help you make the most of it. We offer free case consultations, so please don't hesitate to contact me directly at 949-632-0029 or via email at cpauley@medivest.com.
Hi, gorgeous. This is episode number 292.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is David Capson. On behalf of the Education Committee, I just want to welcome everyone to our October seminar. We're so happy that you could take time away from your practices and your home lives to be able to join us for an excellent program this morning. Certainly not our usual experience with the fall seminar. I'm sure we all miss the opportunity to be in person with one another and enjoy the campus and facilities at American University's Law School, but much like the theme of this program, this is the new normal, at least for now. So hopefully we can all be together again soon and before the next seminar in March of 2021. We're very excited to get it started this morning, and I'm going to give just a brief rundown of our program. But before I do that, I want to give a huge shout out and some praise to our wonderful sponsors. We just watched an awesome video and saw some of the great things they can do. We have with us this morning Matt Workman and Nate Pascal from Planet Depot's Diamond sponsors. Thank you guys. Chris Peters from Multi-Specialty Healthcare Platinum sponsors. Thank you for being with us. Capital Healthcare Gold sponsors. We have Nagora Akhmedov and a new rep, Nagora's son and U.S. Air Force Captain Beck. So welcome, Beck. Thank you for your service. We're happy to have you with us. We look forward to getting to know you in the future. Just a quick note on Capital Healthcare. They are donating a $200 gift card. We're going to be doing a raffle before our final speaker of the day, so please hang with us for that one. We have Gavin O'Hare from CED Technologies, bronze sponsor. Welcome, Gavin. And Marcia Bell from Bell Legal Nurse Consulting, bronze sponsor. Thank you and welcome. Without sponsors like these, pulling off events like this would not be possible. They're great resources for all of our practices, so please take advantage of our relationship with them and utilize their service whenever you possibly can. Back to our program. First we have Linda Lispin. She's the CEO of the American Association for Justice. With the election just a few short weeks away, Linda's going to give us an overview of the political landscape, some key races that the AAJ is keeping an eye on closely. And Linda will be taking some questions, so please utilize the Q&A box if you do have a question. And that goes for all of our speakers, by the way. After Linda, we're very excited to have the great pleasure to hear from Senator Tim Kaine. And Senator Kaine will also be taking some questions if there's time, so please, again, use that Q&A box. After Senator Kaine, we'll have political strategist Bruce Mehlman. He's going to treat us to one of his famous slide decks and also give some thoughts on how the current political, economic, and social landscape will shape our practices for years to come. And as we had sent around in the emails, this is the portion of the program that earned us a Virginia CLE credit. So thanks to Bruce for that. And finally, we'll have John Gamble. He's going to give a presentation on the empirical jury. This talk is going to be incredibly helpful in terms of virtual jury selections, negotiating with the other side in mediation, and just overall useful for adding value to our cases. So certainly areas that fit with our theme of practicing in the new normal. So with that, let's get it started. I'd like to introduce the president of the DCTLA, Kara Fay, and she's going to get us off and running. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. I have the pleasure of opening up the seminar to Linda Lipson, the current CEO of the American Association for Justice, a DC resident, and probably the best lobbyist in DC that represents our interests, trial lawyers' interests. Linda and her staff have worked very hard recently to stop tort reform and ensure that we keep and add pro-civil justice candidates, both in the Senate and while we protect our clients every day, Linda's protecting us every day up on the Hill. So I hope everybody shows their support. And if you're not a member of AAJ or you don't contribute to the AAJ PAC, I think that you should reconsider and start to contribute. Linda works very hard to do what she's doing, and we've been under a lot of fire lately, as all of you know. So without much ado, I'm going to let Linda take over and explain what she thinks is going on with politics and the current election. I'm sure there is lots to say, and like David said, if you have any questions, please put them below in the chat box. Thank you, Linda, and thank you for being such a good friend to both me and all trial lawyers.
Thanks so much, Kara. Hello, Mary. Hello, all my friends in DC. I so wish we could all be together. And I just hope soon. I mean, I'm done with this, but it seems like it's going to be going on for a while. AAJ has been teleworking since the end of March, but we've produced more education programs than we ever have, and the show must go on. You all, I have to say, it continues to be a privilege to represent you, particularly now, because the agencies that are in, the federal agencies that are supposed to be protecting the health and safety of Americans are just ghost towns. There's nobody home. And so you all, in pursuing justice for your clients, are really the only avenue for redress right now, and the best avenue for redress. I hope can we go off the record so I can be, Mary, is that possible?
Yeah, so you want me to stop recording? Is that
yes,
what you're saying?
yes.
All right, hold on, let me find it.
Okay.
Let me put my glasses back on.
Practicing as a civil rights attorney representing victims of housing discrimination by insurance companies before holding elected office. Mayor of Richmond, Lieutenant Governor, and of course, Governor of Virginia before being elected to the Senate in 2012. He's now in his second term. He sits on several key committees: budget, armed services, foreign relations, and health. And he's very committed to a lot of the issues that are really important to all of us, like access to courts, consumer protection issues, access to quality healthcare for all, protecting the rights and promoting the rights of women and minorities, to name just a few. So we are very excited to hear from him about the state of things on the Hill right now and the implications of this election on us as individuals and as trial lawyers. So Senator Kaine, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a friend of this group and to trial lawyers in general. The floor is yours.
Well, Amanda, thank you. I'm really happy that you asked me to come back. I enjoyed that session up at American University in 2018, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So, the problem is there's too much to talk about, but what I want to do is talk about what you guys want to talk about. So I'll offer some thoughts right now, a little bit about the Supreme Court, the election, and then kind of aftermath. But what I hope to do is just have a good exchange, and I'll let you be my moderator of questions and answers when we get into it for as long as you want me. I know you have other agenda items too. First, thank you for doing what you're doing. I am a civil rights lawyer who's taken a temporary 26-year side turn into elected office. I practiced law in Richmond for 17 years, doing primarily plaintiffs' civil rights work, most of it in the housing discrimination area, as you mentioned. And I worked with and met some of the very best people in the world doing civil rights work. And so I really appreciate what the DC Bar does and what you all do to maintain courts that are open to our citizens. We can't have a functioning democracy if everyday people don't have access to courts. And that's what you guys are about. That's what our trial bar is about. I heard Linda talking. That's her primary focus in her role with the AHA. Look, this is the most important election of my life. This is the most important vote I will ever cast. And you might think, well, wait, you were on a national ticket in 2016. Wasn't that the most important election in your life? And the answer is no. This one's more important. And I'm a young guy who intends to vote for another 30 or 40 years, but this one's more important than any of those two. And the good news is with early voting, we're seeing tremendous energy and excitement. But the reason it's so important is so many issues are on the ballot. Will we battle against climate change or deny science? Will we expand healthcare to provide coverage to more or take healthcare away from people? Will we erode those rights? Will we rejoin the family of nations and once again celebrate allies and build up multilateral institutions rather than degrading them or tearing them down? There's just so many issues that are at stake. And another issue, and this is a partisan one, but I'm just going to be honest, it's a personal one that will sound partisan, but I'm just going to be honest. I think another key issue on the ballot in November is this. America has proceeded by fits and starts toward this equality goal that Jefferson set out. An imperfect guy set out a perfect goal. And we proceeded by fits and starts toward it, getting closer and then falling short, getting closer and then falling short. So we've made mistakes and we failed along the way, just like as individuals, our society and our country has too. But one of the great things about our country is that we've shown the capacity to learn from mistakes and improve and get better. And I think that's kind of what's on the ballot in November. Do we still have the capacity to look in the mirror and say, you know, we've gone the wrong direction. We didn't have to have 200,000+ people dead of COVID. We didn't have to have an economic collapse because we mismanaged the pandemic, because other nations manage it better and haven't seen an economic collapse. I think the ability of us as voters to look in the mirror and say, okay, well, we made a mistake, we went the wrong direction, but we can correct it, we can improve. I think that's on the ballot. And I want to believe about us as Americans that we can continue to assess ourselves and improve when we get things wrong, because we'll get things wrong forever. But if we retain the ability to improve and make it better, then there's always such hope and optimism about our great country. We are facing a very challenging dynamic right now with respect to the Supreme Court nomination. During my time in the Senate, the GOP has made 3 changes to the way we deal with Supreme Court cases, Supreme Court vacancies. The first was the refusal to entertain the nomination of Merrick Garland. Republicans certainly had the ability to vote against him, and that would have been consistent with advise and consent. But for the first time, we won't even entertain a hearing and we won't meet with him. And we'll announce a new rule that during an election year, a presidential election year, the new rule will be let the people decide. We'll wait until the people choose the president and the Senate, and then we'll entertain filling a vacancy. That was unprecedented. We urged them not to do it, but they did. That was a historic change. Second, during the nomination of Justice Gorsuch, we changed from a 60-vote threshold for Supreme Court nominees to 50. Democrats, while in majority, had left the threshold for 60 for Supreme Court, even though it might have been in our advantage to change it to 50 because we had the majority and the White House. But we made that change because we kept it at 60 because we believe that the Supreme Court appointment is the most important and there should be some demonstrated bipartisan support for somebody to get on the court. Republicans made that change with respect to the Gorsuch nomination. And now they're proposing to go back on their word about this Garland rule, and no longer is it let the people decide in an election year. Instead, they're rushing to fill the RBG vacancy. We've urged them not to make the 2 previous changes. They did anyway. We're urging them not to make this change. They seemed determined to do it anyway. Why are they so bent on this nomination, this vacancy being filled so fast? Why are they so bent on doing it even though they told the American public that they would uphold the let the people decide rule even if there was a Republican president? It all has to do with the Affordable Care Act. In my time in the Senate, the single greatest goal of the GOP, and certainly since President Trump has come into office, has been to destroy the Affordable Care Act. They've tried it administratively. They've tried it through repeated votes, getting to the floor of the Senate, and one of the most moving and momentous moments of my life in August of 2017 when John McCain cast the key vote to save the Affordable Care Act. They've tried it in repeated court suits. They've failed all along the way, and the Affordable Care Act has only gotten more popular. But now they see the opportunity to do it. They see California versus Texas on November 10 as their best chance to basically finally catch Moby Dick and get rid of the Affordable Care Act. But because the Supreme Court has a tradition that if you're not in your seat when a case is argued, you don't participate in the decision of the case, that is the reason for the rush. And it's interesting, no surprise that the two Republicans who aren't going along with the rush, Susan Murkowski and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, those were the two Republicans who, together with John McCain, voted with Democrats to save the Affordable Care Act. They know what the big game is in town. And that's the reason that they're with us on this notion that we shouldn't have a rush. If Republicans want to get this through before Election Day, they can. There are things that Democrats can do that might slow it down a bit. But if they're bound and determined to break their word so they can put somebody on to help them repeal the ACA, they can make it happen. What we're hoping is that with our advocacy and with some of the questions in committee next week, we might cause some Republican members to join Collins and Murkowski and think, we should wait and let the people decide before we take this momentous step, a step that would dramatically undermine the legitimacy of the court as the earlier two changes did. I can't argue that the Republicans don't have the legal power to do what they're attempting to do, because the composition of the court is a matter that's left to Congress, and they have the majority in the Senate right now. But if they do it and make this third change to filling the Supreme Court vacancy, they're going to badly damage the legitimacy of the branch, actually both branches, the Senate and the courts. And so I view this as very existential to the health of the institutions, but also to this critical question of whether we want to take health insurance away from millions of Americans in the midst of a global pandemic. The election issues are I heard, Linda talking about them. The good news is dramatic early voting happening everywhere, which is an indication both of energy and people understand the stakes, but also people are worried about their health, and they believe if they can kind of spread out voting over a period of time, that would be a good thing. It's too early to predict. I'll answer questions, because I think what will happen if President Trump's reelected, or if Joe Biden's elected, or what will happen if the Senate goes one way or the other? What might we see in January 2021? I would like to address those to the extent that you asked them. I will tell you this. We hoped we would get a next COVID bill, a fifth bill. We got four in a bipartisan way. We were making real progress. I was on a call with Democrats on Tuesday afternoon, and we were reporting significant progress toward a fifth bill with Secretary Mnuchin when all of a sudden the president announced that he was suspending negotiations. That makes me believe now that we won't get a fifth bill before Election Day, but for a variety of reasons, no matter who wins the presidency on Election Day, I think the pressure will be overwhelming on us to get a fifth COVID bill because the American public needs it. And then once the election is past us, it clears away some of the smoke in the air, and I believe we'll get a bill that will be of the kind that Jay Powell testified the other day that we need, a big bill to help families and save the economy at this critical time. So I'm really happy to be together with you, Amanda and team, and I'm really happy now to open it up and take questions. And I'm assuming you can moderate for me so I don't have to pick and choose who to call on.
Sorry, it's Kara or Mary, are you gonna?
Oh, I thought you were gonna do it, Amanda.
Okay. Well, I guess it looks like we have a question from Sal here.
Some in the chat too. Oh, and there's some in the Q&A and the chat.
Yes, okay. So while Trump and Pence fail to answer debate questions at a far greater rate, one unanswered question looms large for Biden and Harris. Will they pack the Supreme Court? How would you advise Biden to respond to that question at the next debate, should they occur?
Here's what I would say, and I think he could say something like this. Number one, it's not the administration that packs the court. The composition of the court is purely for Congress. So there's nothing they can do about packing the court. It's up to Congress. What should they want from Congress? So let me tell you what the Democratic view is. We have no court packing plan, none. I go to Democratic lunches. We do them by conference call twice a week. We never talk about court packing. What we talk about is Republicans, please honor your word. Please honor your word. If you honor your word, the topic wouldn't even come up. We urge them to not break tradition and stiff arm Merrick Garland. They refused. We urge them to not change the 60 vote threshold for Supreme Court justices to continue to maintain some bipartisanship. They refused. We're urging them, please follow your word about let the people decide in this vacancy. And we hope that some will wake up and do it. And if they do, and they follow their word, I think court packing will be something that, law reviews might write about, but it's not going to be a big priority for anyone. But if they work to destroy the legitimacy of the institution of the court, then naturally a Congress that is vested with the power to determine the composition of the court will have to grapple with how do we restore its legitimacy. And we should restore its legitimacy, not just, well, they did this, and so we should do something partisan too. That would continue to weaken its legitimacy. But we'll have to entertain, if they yet again violate their promises, we'll have to entertain, are there matters within our power that could build up and restore the legitimacy of a court that they have destroyed?
Thank you. Okay, next question. What facts in Judge Barrett's judicial and personal record indicate that she is likely to overturn advancements in civil rights, women's rights, access to courts, healthcare, voting, etc.? That's a question.
Wow. So that's a long question. And let me tell you this, my position is I'm going to oppose anybody. I said before she was nominated, whether it's Judge Judy or Aaron Judge, I'm not let the Republicans go back on their promise. I'm not going to entertain a nominee that's offered before election day. Let the people decide. However, you've asked the question specifically about Judge Barrett. Here's the kinds of things I think you'll hear questions about next week. First, her fairly extensive writing, both academic writing and legal decisions challenging the Affordable Care Act. As an academic, she has written critically of Justice Roberts' decision upholding the Affordable Care Act. As an academic and judge, she's written critically about the contraception mandate component of the Affordable Care Act. So I think she has a fairly significant record that would make it fairly safe to predict that she would be a vote to overturn the Affordable Care Act and throw millions of people off health insurance. So you're going to hear about that. With respect to women's rights, contraception, and abortion, you're going to hear questions about her written record that Roe versus Wade was barbaric. That's a newspaper ad she signed. You're going to hear questions about what did she mean by that? Did she read the ad, etc. That ad also indicated that what the law should be is that life begins at fertilization. If that was the law of the land in the United States nationally right now, it would outlaw use of the pill or the morning after pill or intrauterine devices. And the overturning of Roe versus Wade means that states could go back to criminalizing certain forms of contraception and abortion. However you think about abortion, and look, people of goodwill have very legitimate differences of opinion on this issue. It is an important issue, of course it is, from a moral standpoint. But the use of the criminal law to penalize women and doctors for reaching their own moral conclusions about this important matter, to me, seems barbaric. And the notion that you would overturn Roe versus Wade and go back to a point where we define life to begin at conception, and now you can use the criminal law to enforce that, I think you'll hear that question asked. With respect to voting rights, I'm unaware of a Seventh Circuit opinion that Judge Barrett has written that deals squarely with voting rights, but here's an opinion I would urge folks to read if you haven't. It's an opinion called Cantor v. Barr. It's a gun rights case in which the Seventh Circuit was asked to overturn the application of Wisconsin and federal law banning a convicted felon of owning a gun. Cantor had been convicted of mail fraud. In the Heller versus DC opinion, Justice Scalia said, hey, look, the Second Amendment does apply to individuals, but it does say well-regulated. Certain regulations of the Second Amendment are presumptively legal. And Justice Scalia mentioned the felon ban as one of the regulations that was presumptively legal. That was the case that was posed about this nonviolent felon in Cantor v. Barr. The majority, a Reagan appointee writing the opinion, said this felon ban is lawful. It's consistent with the Second Amendment, citing Scalia and other precedent. But Judge Barrett, in a very lengthy opinion, 37 pages, went deeply into her originalist philosophy. And what she concludes is, no, that you can't apply the consistent with the Second Amendment, a gun ban to Cantor, a nonviolent felon. But she does conclude in the opinion that you could ban Cantor from voting for the rest of his life. It's not a voting rights case, it's a gun case. But her originalist philosophy leads her to conclude that gun rights are more important than voting rights. And if I was doing my old work as a civil rights lawyer in the South that I did before I got into elected office, the notion of downgrading the importance of voting rights in such a way and claiming that an originalist legal philosophy dictated that outcome, I would find that very frightening.
Thank you for that. There's quite a few questions here now. Let's see. How will a Democrat Congress restore the power of Congress to subpoena executive branch officials?
That's a boy, what a great question. I think the first thing that we will do is we would exercise our oversight, but we would exercise oversight with an administration, because I don't think we're going to have a Democratic Senate without a Democratic White House. We could have a Democratic White House without a Democratic Senate. I don't see the reverse. The good news about President Biden is that he loves the Senate. He loves the Article I branch, and he understands why it's so important. So you're not going to see a Biden administration flouting congressional oversight again and again and again, from refusing to provide documents to refusing to allow witnesses to come and testify. So I think that the most important way we kind of renormalize the idea of congressional oversight is showing that it works, showing that an administration can do this and continue to govern, and Congress can exercise oversight. I think that's the most important thing we can do. With respect to what changes we might make in legal process or hopefully in court rulings to clarify the legitimacy of congressional subpoenas, et cetera, I haven't really thought about that, but I would say the best thing we can do is just model proper behavior to the American public so that they see that congressional oversight respected by an administration is by far the best way for the branches to interact with one another.
Okay. Here's a question that I think we touched on a little bit with Linda, but in terms of Trump sort of becoming, exceedingly desperate, what acts do you believe define the outer limits of what Trump will do to stay in office? Is there a way to prepare to what you see as the worst case scenario?
Boy, Amanda, I don't think there is an outer limit to what the president will do. I definitely think there are outer limits to what people around him will allow. I think there are outer limits to what the American public will allow, but I don't believe there's outer limits to what he will attempt. And so the real question is, what should we do to prepare for that? And I kind of put myself in Linda's camp. I came in right at the end of her Q&A. The single best thing we can do to dramatically reduce the possibility of post-election mischief is to make the results of the election as clear as possible. So as I've kind of been thinking about how I allocate my time, I could spend some time to thinking about the post-election scenarios. And there are people who are, but for me, the best way to spend my time is working in Virginia. And then outside Virginia, sort of, I'm only politically relevant probably in terms of dealing with Latino voters, just because, I can go on TV and radio in Spanish and campaign in Latino communities, and we still don't have enough people who do that. But the single best thing that we can do between now and November 3rd is just do all we can to make the election result as clear as possible. And in Virginia, I feel particularly called to do that because we close our polls first in the nation. 7 o'clock Eastern time, Virginia closes our polls. And so we'll have a relatively early result in Virginia compared to the rest of the nation, and it will set a tone. People understand that Virginia is a battleground state that's now slightly blue, but if we report a result on election night that's not slightly for Joe Biden, but that's significantly for Joe Biden, then people will start to see a pattern and will start to send a message that I think is a very powerful one about, okay, this election is going to be clear and definitive. And that's what I'm trying to do with my colleagues in Virginia, to send an early message of clear and definitive as best we can. There are people thinking about the post-election scenarios if President Trump decides to prematurely claim victory, or order that voting be stopped here, or dispatch his personal attorney / attorney general to do stuff. But I'm just trying to I'm trying to do all I can just to maximize the chance of a big, big win that's unmistakable.
Thanks. Here's another one. I've seen suggestions that the Democrats in the Senate can do things like refuse to meet with Judge Barrett, fail to show for the committee hearings in order to deny a quorum, and take other measures to try to deny the legitimacy of what the Republicans are doing here. Are there plans to do any of this, or is the plan simply to try to work behind the scenes and hold Senator Collins to her word and try to convince others of the same?
It's a little bit of both. We're certainly doing a number of things to demonstrate that this is an illegitimate process and we're not treating it as business as usual. So normally I meet with all nominees. I met with Justice Kavanaugh and met with Justice Gorsuch and had searching conversations with both. I met with Judge Garland when he was nominated, but I have not met, nor will I meet, with Judge Barrett or anyone who's put up in this illegitimate process before the people have decided. And most Democrats are doing what I'm doing. Those of us who would meet with any nominee, we're not dignifying this process with a meeting. The denying of the quorums, et cetera, we could slow this down a bit, but we can't stop the Republicans if they are bound and determined. If they are bound and determined to break their promise to get somebody on the court before the Affordable Care Act case, we can't block them from doing that. So I think you'll see members participating in the hearing when it's held. Now, the sad thing is this hearing, it really shouldn't happen unless it can happen in person. All of you, examine witnesses and you do depositions and trials and credibility determinations. You could make them in person so much easier than you can make them on a screen. And the credibility determination of someone describing their judicial philosophy or claiming that they will be loyal to precedent and not act to overturn it. I want to be in the room and look somebody in the face when they're talking about that. I don't want to rely on a Zoom screen to do it. But that is under the control of the committee chair. So I think what you'll see is when the hearings go forward, likely next week, unless illness gets in the way of that happening, you'll see Democrats on the committee vigorously participating in the Q&A to illuminate aspects of the nominee's record, but particularly to illuminate what is at stake with this particular nomination. And then we're going to try to convince colleagues to come along with us. Remember, a couple of the Republicans have said they feel comfortable moving forward, but have not said how they're going to vote because they're awaiting the hearing to determine how they're going to vote. I think the chances that we would persuade 2 more Republicans are slim, but they're not zero. They're not zero. And so we have to use the hearings to shine a spotlight on issues that could potentially make Republicans decide the right thing to do is to wait until this election is done and let the next president and the next Senate, which could be President Trump and a Republican Senate, but let the next president and the next Senate make this choice.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Mary, do we need to wrap up on this?
We can have, Senator Kane's doing such a great job. I could listen to you all day. This is so fascinating. We could do one more juicy question. How about it? Is that okay, Senator Kane?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Pick a winner, Amanda.
Okay. If the Dems get in power, will they commit to enact new guardrails to protect our system? For example, S1 should be a law that the IRS will release federal tax returns of any candidate who qualifies to run for president. Another new law should make it a crime for any executive branch official to refuse to at least appear in person before Congress, even if he claims privilege. We must restore checks and balances.
I completely agree with that. The only thing that I would say is I think priority 1 should be helping Americans who are suffering in this unprecedented time. 200,000+ deaths, Dr. Fauci said on the current path, This week, 9 states reported their highest 7-day average of new coronavirus cases since the start of the pandemic. So this is not going away. It's coming back with a vengeance as people are coming indoors more. I had coronavirus in April and May, and in March and April. It's really easy to get it. 85% of the American public, probably, maybe 90% haven't had it yet. Those who haven't had it are essentially kindling before this virus, which is easy to get. As more people come indoors, as the weather cools down, we're going to be at a period of significant exposure. And so the health risk and the consequent economic damage are going to be massive. And so if I were going to order priority, what we should do as Democrats, should we get the chance, my first priority has got to be massive relief to people who are suffering, small businesses, state and local governments, our healthcare network, so we can get through this crisis. I do believe rules of the kind that you described to fix a system to disable a future would-be authoritarian from violating norms would be important, and we would need to do it. We need to pass the John Lewis Act to restore the Voting Rights Act. We need to pass H.R. 1 to get dark money out of politics and guarantee transparency. There's a series of governmental reforms that we have to undertake, but I think easing the suffering of individuals and families should be our priority one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Always good to be with you guys, and I hope the rest of your day goes very, very well.
Thanks. Same to you. Thanks again. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, take care.
Well. Thanks, Amanda. I'm going to turn it over to Karen now.
Thank you, Mary. Good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing Bruce Mehlman. He's here today to discuss his one-of-a-kind infographic slideshow, The Great Acceleration, How 2020 is Bringing the Future Faster. Bruce Mehlman is a strategist and lawyer, and he currently leads a bipartisan firm that he founded. Prior to this position, he served at senior levels in public policy, business and the law, including such positions as the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy and Policy Counsel for Cisco Systems. A highly sought-after speaker and author, Bruce's quarterly updates on political trends are widely read by business leaders and political observers across the country, and he frequently appears on television and has been covered in the Washington Post, Politico, CNN, CNBC, Fortune, the Daily Caller, and the University of Virginia Center for Politics. I also wanted to mention that he has a fascinating bipartisan podcast called 14&G that can be found on the firm's website. Recent topics include COVID hits the White House and 2020 in 20 minutes. And I'm going to turn it over to Bruce.
Karen, thanks for such a great introduction. And Mary and team, I appreciate your inviting me, although I'm not sure I realized I was the right after Senator Kaine speaker. I'm not sure I would have accepted. He's so cool. He's so interesting. The guy shows up in a flannel shirt, uncombed hair, and is the man. Like, answers to everything, really smart. I'm going to do my best as at least my hair is brushed, but as a decidedly non-famous, not as interesting as Senator Kaine. But when we think about the things he's talking about, the things we're all living through, 2020 feels historically disruptive to me. And maybe it feels the same way to you. And if it does, you should trust your instincts. Since 1900, this is the 31st presidential election we've all been through, or actually a few of us have been through since 1900, but the nation has been through. It's the 24th recession in that period of time. There have been about 30 years where you had sustained multi-city protests. And thankfully, we've only had 4 global pandemics in that time. But how many years have had all 4 of those in the same year? Just one, just 2020. And in trying to understand what that's going to mean for the future, we've concluded, trying to analyze the trends, that we think 2020 is going to prove to be far more accelerative than transformational. It's going to take the trends we saw yesterday that define what's happening today and going to accelerate their impact into the future. So this morning, what I will do is I'll talk about these trends, technological trends, geopolitical trends, cultural trends, where they were right before this year, how they're impacting this year, and what they likely mean for the future with a healthy dose of electoral forecasting here. So first, technologically, we wouldn't be having this meeting 30 years ago virtually that we're able to do on Zoom. But over the last 3 decades, everything became digitized, everything became networked, everything was made mobile and influenced by social media. That's created extraordinary opportunities for people to run smarter businesses, for healthcare to leverage health data to be far smarter. I recall my days way back at the law firm in the very early innings of the internet as a public thing, when we were suddenly, you didn't have to go to the law library. You had access to so much more information. You could find precedent and prior filings from your own firm more easily. These days, if you invent an app, you can get it to 4 billion people around the world instantly. But that creates challenges too. McKinsey Global Institute describes this as a superstar economy, where those with access to capital, those with more education and more skills, those who are more digitized, not only have a lead, but their lead is growing. And so we've seen a rising inequality between the techno haves and the techno have-nots. And heading into this year, we began to see a backlash against the data dominant companies. There was too little consumer protection. There's too little competition. And the current antitrust laws don't necessarily apply. That's a really disruptive 3 decades preceding this year. But that wasn't the only thing that was going on. The world was changing. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. Just 2 years later, the Soviet Empire disappeared, and all of the nations that had been behind the Iron Curtain joined the global economy. That same year, 1991, India had major reforms and it joined the global economy. Add just 2 more years and you had those same kind of economic reforms in China, which became more globalized. And that same year, 1993, the EU was born. If you add only 1 more year, so that's a 3-year window, you have the passage of NAFTA here and the creation of the World Trade Organization. What ensued was 3 decades of hyper-globalization, opportunities for global supply chains, opportunities to attract and to participate in global markets, to attract global capital, to attract global talent. Great opportunities for as consumers, as folks who ran businesses, but challenges too. For many in the middle class, they perceived their jobs were being sent to low-wage countries such as China or Mexico as a result of labor arbitrage or tax arbitrage or regulatory arbitrage. For others, we were promised that China joining the World Trade Organization would become more liberalized. But under President Xi, it's become more authoritarian. And as a result, also heading into this year was another backlash. This one had been growing for a little while against globalization. We saw populists run and win in elections in places like Brazil, Bolsonaro, Mexico, AMLO, the United States, Donald Trump, the UK, Boris Johnson, and the Brexiteers. That's also a really disruptive 3 decades we've been through. While that was all happening, of course, our country was changing as well. As recent as 1970 in America, 68% of Americans were both white and had not gone to college. They were comfortable in their conformity, but there were too few opportunities for Americans of color. As a result of demographic change and civil rights movements, today, there are far more diverse voices that are able to be heard. It's true with the murder of George Floyd, we obviously have a long way to go to realize our national ideals, but it's also fair to say diverse Americans have more opportunities today than they did 50 years ago or 100 years ago or more. But while many new voices can be heard, one of the voices that's been lost is the voice of the referee. The most trusted person in America in 1969 was not a business leader, was not a government leader, was not a military leader. It was the guy who read the news on TV. It was Walter Cronkite. Americans and their families would turn on the television. Why? To be informed. What is Vietnam? What's happening in Vietnam? What does Sputnik mean? What should we think about Watergate? When we would go vote, we would start with a shared set of facts and assumptions. And only then would we form opinions, but we saw the other side as the loyal opposition. These days, the media doesn't inform, they affirm. If you're right of center, you watch Fox News. If you're left of center, you watch MSNBC. In fact, I tweeted something yesterday that's kind of going nuts on the on Twitter. It was a Pew poll that came out yesterday. And what they found is people whose only source of news is Fox or talk radio, which is right-wing talk radio, 90% of those folks believe the federal government did everything it possibly could have to prevent the spread of COVID. For people whose only source of news is MSNBC, CNN, or NPR, 97% of those folks don't think the government did everything it could. So that's a hell of a wide gap, and it makes policy harder. And we're seeing a backlash amongst these cultural trends too. The one thing the backlash has in common is both sides feel like the pace of change is unacceptable. If you're left of center, change is taking too long. Women are still paid less than men to do the same job. There is still systemic racism in our policing so many years after Dr. King marched. On the right of center, many of those folks say there's too much political correctness. They feel like they're strangers in their own country. They don't think they have opportunities to get ahead. They think the system is rigged in favor of the elitists on the coasts. That is a really disruptive 3 decades preceding 2020. And in the 20th century, we might have turned to these institutions that we belong to help make sense of the world. But in the 21st century, these institutions don't really have our trust anymore. The radical transparency enabled by the internet has demonstrated they don't really deserve our trust. And when Gallup polls the question, asking about institutions, they do this every year, how much trust do you have? A level of great deal of trust or quite a lot of trust, if you compare where we were at the start of each arrow in 1979 to where we are today, you've seen a major erosion in trust in every institution except the military. So when you have all of this disruptive change and you don't trust the institutions to be there for you, what does it mean for your politics? It means disruption arrives in politics. We have a federal election, as you know, every 2 years. In the 10 federal elections from 1960 to 1978, the party controlling the House, the Senate, and or the White House changed hands 3 times. Fast forward, you have 10 more federal elections from 1980 to 1998. And of these 10, 4 were change elections. This century, 10 more federal elections, starting in 2000, going through the midterms in 2018. Of these 10, 8 were change elections. For those whose theory of everything is everything's explained by Donald Trump, politically, he arrived at the tail end here in 2016. He's far more of a symptom than he is a cause. Or maybe if you think Washington was a dumpster fire, he's a bucket of gasoline. He's an accelerant, but the fire predates him. What I believe explains the reason people keep voting for change and the disruption is because so many Americans looked at their lives and felt like the institutions and policies and parties of the 20th century were not protecting them against the realities of the 21st century. They felt fragile. I don't think this year is going to help that. I think this year is only going to add more fuel to that fire. First, pandemics. Who could have seen a pandemic coming? I don't know. Anybody who read Time magazine? With SARS in 03, how bad will H1N1 get in 07? Why you'll be wearing masks again in 09? The next pandemic, we're not ready, 2017. Folks should have seen this coming. There were plans, but they weren't followed. We weren't prepared. Likewise, we've seen huge safety net gaps in American society, but why are folks surprised? The data showed well before this year that more than half of American households had no emergency savings. The 36 million Americans without health insurance were far more likely to have pre-existing conditions, which are COVID comorbidities. The 21 million plus American households without broadband can't work from home. Their kids can't go to virtual school. If you didn't have paid sick leave, when you spiked a fever, you went to work. Why? Your family needed the paycheck and you spread the disease. We're properly talking about social justice, but again, this is not a 2020 phenomenon. We've seen for decades, white earners earn more on average than black earners, even for the same jobs. The wealth gap between white households and African-American households is 10 to 1. If you encounter the police unarmed and you're African-American, you're 4 times more likely to die than if you're white under the same circumstances. And you're more likely to be in jail. That's the world, the disruptive world, the fragile world that predates this crazy year. So where are we today? And again, I'll go through technology, geopolitics, and culture. Technologically, we're seeing that the digitized are thriving. You know, those who can work from home or who can enable you to work from home, those who have figured out how to leverage technology, they're thriving. And look what the stock market's shown. The S&P 500, not including the tech companies, down 3% for the year. But the big famous tech companies are up off through the roof, off the charts. The digitized are thriving. The undigitized, the eds, the meds, the feds, well, they're failing. So incredibly, this is insane, that 19 years after 9/11 shut down all of the commercial airspace over the United States, Congress still had not put in place a plan to be able to work remotely in a national emergency. The House, not the Senate, decided finally this year to implement something they call proxy voting. They're all proud of it. It's a big reform, but the biggest reform in congressional process in decades is literally phoning it in. That's not that impressive. We've always made elections harder than we should. That's, I think, a discredit to democracy, but even in the states that make it easier to vote, few offer the flexibility you're going to need in a year when you have something like a pandemic. I plan to vote in person. It's something I like to do, but I'd love to know what the virus is going to look like that week. There are huge opportunities that we're enjoying and we're realizing now to deliver healthcare via telehealth electronically, but a lot of barriers were in place prior to this year that made the rollout slower, and there was not nearly as much experience among providers or among patients as there could have been had we embraced reforms in this sector more rapidly. And when you think about schools, sorry to do this to you, Mary, but here's New York state law. In Albany, they passed a law that said that K-12 schools need to have 12 fire drills per year, not 11, not 13. And they micromanaged even more. They said 8 of such drills will be evacuation drills, 4 of those will use the fire escapes, and 4 will be shelter-in-place drills. Great, I want my kids to be able to leave a burning building. But how often did they practice learning from home or remote teaching? Never. They were unprepared. And we've seen in our schools in this area and elsewhere the problem, if you don't prepare for something, you don't tend to do very well at it. Geopolitically today, unfortunately, multilateralism was sick before COVID arrived. The trade wars that undermine trust and cooperation and collaboration among world leaders. So when this new malady hit, instead of having the ventilators and the protective gear in China when they needed it, moving to Italy and then to Spain and to New York City, and just in time, nations and states have had to fight over stockpiling their own supplies to be prepared. The 2 nations in the world that would have been best positioned to lead the world out of this would be the US and China. We're not cooperating. We're blaming each other. China says we were inept in responding to it. Some truth to that. And we say China was dishonest, that President Xi was playing it down, that he didn't want people maybe to be afraid, but that he was dishonest about what was happening early on, and the rest of us were unable to be prepared. We'll see if nation states fails or if there are refugee crises, but it's already clear that there's great food insecurity. And unfortunately, I think we're going to find by the end of the whole year or two that more people around the world, especially children, will have died from hunger as a result of the COVID disruption than die from COVID itself. Now, I had hoped when this all began, it's a global pandemic, maybe there'll be better global cooperation after this. But thinking about it, I'm probably misapplying the lessons of World War II or 1815. And world wars are failures of diplomacy. You fix what broke. This time, for a lot of folks, they think what was broken was excessive reliance on foreign supply chains, especially from China, and excessive allowance of trade and tourism. And we're likely to see nationalism as a result this time. Culturally, I want to live, and I think Senator Kane's a good example of this. I wanted to live in an America where we're all in this together, as opposed to a team red or a team blue, or as this shows, a team rich or a team poor. And in prior recessions, generally higher wage earners and lower wage earners suffered fairly evenly, not quite. But this time, with the K-shaped recovery we're seeing, it's an extraordinary differential between those who earn the most and those who earn the least. And it's turning the COVID situation into a ground zero of a culture war. Recall when you had the financial collapse? The net bailouts was $500 billion. We tapped out at 8.6 million unemployed. A quarter of us were on social media, and that was enough to give rise on the left to the Occupy movement, demanding more redistribution, and on the right to the Tea Party, demanding smaller government. Well, this time the bailouts are already 6 times bigger. They may get to 8 or 10 times bigger. The peak unemployed, 7 times as many as before. 3 times as many Americans are on social media now. We're not calling ourselves Occupy 2.0 or Tea Party 2.0, but that's kind of what it feels like. On the left, they say you need to trust science. On the right, they ask, you mean the scientists at the CDC who blew the tests, or the experts who assured us that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction? On the left, they say, look, it's about collective responsibility. It's to the planet. It's to the future. It's to the old couple down the street who are at risk of COVID. But on the right, it's the voice of Elon Musk. If you don't want to go to work, I'm not going to make you go to work. But why are you telling me I can't go to work? I've built this business with my hands for 30 years. I want to take the risk. Don't tell me I can't. On the left, they say we need to save lives, and they're right. On the right, they point out we need to save jobs, and they're right too. So we've become a nation in masks, astounded at the arrogance of those who refuse in MAGA hats, and a nation in MAGA hats, astounded at the arrogance of those who I think I should have said ignorance before, the arrogance of those wearing masks who think everybody can work from home. As for the 2020 election, the events of this year have obviously massively redefined it. It'll be decided in one of three lanes. First, it'll be a referendum on the administration's handling of the pandemic. Now, Donald Trump will tell you he is a wartime president, and he's, if you watch without the sound, he's a great visuals guy. He looks like a wartime president. He always gets the TV visuals right. I think his biggest challenge is it doesn't feel like we're winning the war. It feels more like 1942 or 1943. And overall, voters do not think the administration has done a good job. If it's a referendum on the pandemic, he loses. But it's also a choice. We're coming off a recession. Recovery is going to take a while. Which candidate do you believe has the better tax and regulatory and other policies to help ignite growth and restore the economy? And in this, the White House is trying to make it a choice between the reopener in chief and Lockdown Joe. And all of the polling just about, CNN last week, Biden was up 2, but the Wall Street Journal last week, Trump was up 7. All of the polling just about says Trump is perceived to be better for the economy than Biden. Pew came out this morning with Trump +2, and he's worse than Biden head to head on everything else they say. There are going to be a decent number of voters who are going to start the sentence with, I don't like what he says in his tweets, but, and they're going to then go on to talk either about the justices on the Supreme Court that they like, or the judges, or they're going to talk about they think he's better on the economy. But the last question is, who do you think the right leader is for this nation at this time? And here it comes down to the closing arguments of each campaign. The Trump campaign's closing argument is you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America. He's too weak. He's too woke or politically correct. He's been in Washington too long. The Biden campaign's closing argument is that Donald Trump's a failed president. He is failing America. He's too divisive. He's too chaotic. And he's too corrupt. If this were the 20th century, the pollsters would ask, which of these guys would you rather get a beer with? Who do you like more? In the 21st century, it's more like, who do you dislike less? And in the 2016 exit polls, voters who did not like Hillary Clinton and did not like Donald Trump, they went for Trump by 17 points. Right now, according to the polls, voters who do not like Donald Trump and do not like Joe Biden are going for Joe Biden by double digits. And that's significant. So I'll offer two more charts, not more than that, but about the elections. One for the people who are rooting for Biden and one for the people who are rooting for Trump, as if on this call. First, disruptive voters seek change frequently. The wrong track, right direction numbers are 2-1. That is America in a flipping mood. White House does not stay in the same party's hands when this many Americans think they're on the wrong track, going back at least in modern history. We want change. The question is, what counts as change? Does change just mean whoever's not there right now? In the 10 federal elections, presidential elections from 1936 through 1972, the candidate whose resume had more years of experience in Washington, on the left side of this chart, well, they won 9 out of 10 times. If you're picking somebody to run your business, you typically want somebody with experience. But then Vietnam happens, and then Watergate happens. And we start losing trust in institutions, and especially in Washington. In the next 11 elections, from 1976 through 2016, the candidate, again on the left, with more years in Washington lost 9 out of 11 times. What might that mean for 2020? Well, Joe Biden had 36 years as a senator and 8 as a vice president, 44 years in Washington, more than any candidate in American history. Trump has just 4. So if change means throw this bomb out, he's done. But if change means we want the less Washington candidate, this could be closer than people appreciate. I know you guys follow the Senate incredibly closely. I won't dive into all of the races other than to say this is Larry Sabato of UVA, 49-49 with 2 toss-ups, Iowa and North Carolina. And increasingly, we're seeing that states tend to follow the presidency. So it's probably too close to call. Though some of the polling that I've seen gives me the impression that Democrats have a better chance of getting to 50 than the Republicans. North Carolina was a lean Dem until the sexting scandal moved their candidate from lean Dem back to toss-up, back to even. Now, I have not been the greatest guest because I have not been particularly uplifting. I'm going to try in talking about technology, geopolitics, and culture where we're going. I'm going to try to offer why I am an optimist. Starting with the year I was born, America had an incredible accomplishment in 1969. And as you recall, with the assassinations of 68, the Vietnam War, there was a lot of domestic strife, but we accomplished something great. But it was more than a shot in the arm, as it turns out. The semiconductor industry got launched as a result of the moon mission. New technologies such as Velcro got launched. We're all focused on what's happening, trying to come up with the therapeutics, trying to come up with a vaccine. But somewhat behind the scenes, there is incredible innovation happening. Companies are moving in what they had planned to do in 5 years, they're getting done in 6 months. It's going to make them more productive. It's going to make them more innovative. Things like wearables. I'm a Fitbit crazy person. They're going to be far better at helping us live healthier lives. 20 years from now, we're going to be reading a story in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or somewhere like that, talking about how the pandemic crisis of 2020 was a Cambrian explosion of innovation. And all of these incredible things were seeded or invented or started then, that in that year 2040, when we're reading the story, are things we take for granted as improvements in our lives. Now, that's a very silver cloud. The dark lining perhaps is that if inequality was increasing as a result of digitized have and have nots, of people who have science, technology degrees and those who do not, that's going to accelerate. So the so-called techlash against big tech, that's going to continue. And likewise, geopolitically, the defining event of the last century, or last half, the second half of the 20th century, was the Cold War. I think the first half of this century, the defining event may be the return of the great power rivalry. So that's not optimistic in the super short term. Whether it's President Joe Biden or President Donald Trump more, we're going to continue to have friction with China. We're going to continue to have decoupling. But I'm also hopeful this is going to lead to a new globalization, a new multilateralism that fits this new world. Because so many of the multilateral institutions that were fantastic, that were built, purpose-built for the Cold War against the Soviets, they served their purpose. We've got to rethink a lot of things, and we're doing that. That's going to happen this decade. I talk about deglobalization. I don't think it means there'll be less overall globalization in 2025 or 2030 than there is today. But the rate of acceleration in the cross-border flow of data, goods, people, that's going to slow down, creates new opportunities in the United States for workers here. It creates fewer opportunities for workers who make things for abroad. But it's part of a disruption in trade economics. Look, David Ricardo and Adam Smith got comparative advantage right. But with 3D printing, with automation, the economics of trade are changing. And with nationalists, they're being disrupted by carrots such as subsidies and sticks such as tariffs. Culturally, tomorrow, we're seeing a realignment of the parties. And this happens in America every couple of decades. In four axes. First, education. When I graduated college, if you had a college degree, you were 4% more likely to be a Republican. Today, if you have a college degree, you're 20% more likely to be a Democrat. Second, gender gap. In 2010, when women were asked which party would they rather see control Congress, it was Democrats +6. Now, when you ask women, NBC, Wall Street Journal pollsters ask women, which party would you rather control Congress? Democrats +22. The growing rural-urban gap is increasingly defining our politics. And a clever political scientist who works with Charlie Cook named Dave Wasserman, he observed that urban counties tend to have Whole Foods and rural counties tend to have Cracker Barrels. So he went and took a look at the Democrats' winning percentage in the counties with Whole Foods, large and growing. And he contrasted that with Democrats' winning percentage in counties with Cracker Barrels, smaller and falling. And the gap between the rural and urban counties, well, when Bill Clinton was first elected, it was 20 points. When he was reelected, it was 25. And it's gone up every election since then. Finally, we're seeing this growing gap in who the parties elect to represent them. In 1961 America, 95% of the House Republicans and 93% of Democrats in the House were both white and male. Well, these days, the Democratic Party looks a lot more like America. Only 38% are both white and male. My Republican Party, regrettably, is only down to 90% still white and male. Now, the good news, I'm an optimist, is that by the year 25, 24, we're going to look like America. But I think the real challenge is if you want to lead a nation, if you want to lead people, they need to know that you can appreciate their life experience, that you've walked miles in their shoes. And it's very hard to expect people to entrust you to represent them if you're not representative of them. Culturally, we'll see how long the COVID crisis lasts, but we're already seeing 4 changes in psychology and attitude. So first, the focus on efficiency, just in time, is giving way to a focus on resilience, just in case, across government, business, and individuals. So government, they're going to want to fund stockpiles, excess capacity. Businesses, they're going to move supply chains not always out of China to America, but frequently out of China to have more alternatives. We're rethinking already how our offices look. And we're also rethinking how often we want to be in our offices. Individuals may be more inclined to avoid public transportation or to live in suburbs instead of downtowns, at least for a short period. The priority of interdependence is giving way to a focus on how to be more self-sufficient. We used to talk about the National Defense Industrial Base. Increasingly, that's also looking at technologies like 5G and semiconductors. Businesses that have been focusing on getting into more markets, global integration, are looking more at vertical integration these days. How do they get more control over their own supply chain to avoid disruption? So many of us are working, cooking, and schooling at home. And while I cannot wait to go back downtown into restaurants, I may become a 4-day-a-week downtown guy instead of a 5. And I'm probably going to stick with making my own morning coffee instead of going to Starbucks. The huge appetite for leverage and risk is giving way to a focus on margin and safety. So recall after 9/11 attacks, there was new transportation security, there was new cargo security laws. After the financial collapse, there were new rules about banking and systemic risk. We are clearly about to have more regulations put in place for better pandemic preparedness and better public health readiness. And we've got to figure out how to fix these safety nets. Businesses face new liability risks. They're going to have to implement new safety procedures. They may want to hold bigger reserves, more liquidity. Individuals may be more likely to rent than own. They may prefer big employers who can borrow from the Fed to startups. Finally, the mindset of abundance is giving way to a mindset of austerity. And I'll conclude right after this. Don't worry, Mary. If you think about the 25-year-olds today, if you're 25, in the first month of first grade, you were sent home because of the 9/11 attacks. In 8th grade, when you got home, maybe your parents were sitting around the kitchen table wondering if they could still afford the mortgage with the housing collapse. These days, you're rocking a huge amount of student debt from a college degree you were told you needed, but you're wondering, did you keep your job? Is your job safe? What's the future hold for you? We saw with the long-lasting recession, depression of the Great Depression, a whole generation was inclined to save more, spend less, borrow less. That has a big impact as consumers, as entrepreneurs. Businesses may hold deeper reserves. We may see many saying, since in an era of hyperactivism, maybe we shouldn't keep buying back so many shares since we had to lay off workers. That's a bad look. And in the short term, we all want to criticize Congress, but the $4 trillion that they agreed to spend earlier, overwhelmingly bipartisan, that helped avert a Great Depression. The Fed chair, many of us think more should be spent in the short term, but we know in the medium and the long term, they're going to look to dial spending back. That's choices that are going to impact education and R&D or defense or infrastructure. And they're going to look to raise new revenue, which means taxes have to go up. Now, I promised I am an optimist, and I am. And part of it is I read a lot of history and I think a lot about history. And when I think about that, we are tied for the most inequality we've ever seen as a nation, that with historic also tied levels of immigration, we have a fight within the country about, is that a good thing or a bad thing? New technologies are changing how we work, live, play, and learn. And politicians, whether it's Sheldon Adelstein of Nevada or Mayor Mike out of New York, are spending tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. They're dominating our politics. And you have these red states and blue states in each election. There is not a problem with that map. That is the Electoral College map from 1888. And I just described America in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, early 1900s, perfectly. This is what America was like back then. And the reason I'm an optimist is I recall change came. To deal with the Bezos and Amazon of their day, Rockefeller or Carnegie, they invented antitrust law. There was worker safety laws and food safety laws and unions protection. To deal with inequality, they amended the Constitution to have the income tax. There were political reforms, like giving women the constitutional protection for the right to vote or direct election of senators. There were social reforms. Business leaders came to state governments and said, we're not getting the workforce we need, and there's this new industrial era afoot. American kids were getting educated through the 8th grade, inconsistent skills, and the so-called high school movement was born. And after about a decade or two of advocacy, every state had every American child educated not just through 8th, but 9th through 12th, learning the skills needed to succeed in the 20th century. And our nation, as a result, had the best workforce heading into that incredible American century. As I think about where we're heading, if I were speaking to you last year, I would have said the mismatch between the institutions and policies of yesterday and the realities of today, that was going to drive reforms anyway, but this year's putting that on steroids. It's accelerating it. We've got to modernize the safety net. It was already unaffordable. It needs to also figure out things such as lifelong learning. We need to reimagine regulation. The Chicago school does not find a problem with what Google does or with what Amazon does, but a lot of small businesses do. And we've got to figure out how to make those adjustments to not slow down America's digital economy, but to make sure more people have an opportunity to succeed in it. We've got to figure out how to do better coping with change. Amazingly, I didn't even get into the fact that a historic 1 million plus acres have burned in California, and the history-setting 10th hurricane is about to hit Louisiana. Climate change is coming. It's here. We're just distracted by Twitter, I guess. But we also have cyber concerns, and there are concerns about future pandemics. For me, the really big one, though, is a superstar economy is great, but it's insufficient. We've got to figure out how to widen the winner's circle, how to create more opportunities for more Americans to succeed through hard work and not be predestined to succeed or fail by high birth. If we can do that, we have great potential for this century of the 21st century being another American century. So I am optimistic, certainly in the medium and the long term. In the short term, I am scared to death. I appreciate your having me. I am happy to take questions or not take questions or whatever you guys do.
That was great, Bruce. Thanks so much. And Bruce has, he put his address up there, but I'll put it in the comments. He does these slides on a quarterly basis, Bruce?
Yep.
They're so great and they're so interesting. So I will put his information down in the chat, and now we'll open it up for questions. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Karen, to handle any questions that anybody might have. I know you have some too as well, Karen.
Sure. Why don't I'll start with a question, Bruce, and thank you. That was fascinating. And how does a loss of trust in institutions, and I know you mentioned the exception is the military, affect the courts?
So I don't recall if I had the Supreme Court number up there. It's done pretty well, better than a lot of the other institutions. It's not holding high. Pew and Gallup do a lot of good polling, at least about the Supreme Court. I haven't seen folks going into the judicial system more broadly. My sense from what I feel like I've seen, and this is unfortunately, this would be inadmissible, but my sense is that people tend to feel like we have an honest judiciary, that it is not, that there are plenty of other nations where you can buy your result, and here at least you can't pay the judge to get your result. I suppose you can, like Mr. Burns in The Simpsons, you can have 200 lawyers with briefcases all show up on your side of it, and you're more likely to win than not. But what I feel like I've seen is people have more confidence in our third branch than they do in the first or the second.
And you mentioned the military is an exception. And I know historically that hasn't always been the case. In the 60s, certainly. And in fact, if you asked veterans in the 90s, as recent as the 90s, they didn't feel they were welcome with open arms. What has been the change?
Well, I think it's a couple. First, I was comparing 1979 and 2019. 1979 was coming off Vietnam. I've never gone to figure out if when the Gallup asked the question was in close proximity to the Desert One disastrous attempt at rescuing hostages. I don't think it was, but the military went through a period of, as it had been a draft military that struggled in Vietnam and had drug use and other things, to an all-volunteer military that professionalized. First and foremost, it got better. It got more competent. It was forced as a result of failures, but honest about prior failures, to look in the mirror and to figure out how do we do our jobs better. So first and foremost, it's more trusted because I think it's become a lot more competent. It's more trusted because there are fewer people who are drafted, and there should be almost no one who's afraid of being drafted. Number three, while we haven't done all that we coulda, shoulda, woulda, nobody's accusing Gulf War veterans of being baby killers, or, America really did realize that in the 60s and the 70s in the Vietnam era, the anger that was shown towards frequently drafted veterans was wrong. And we don't do that anymore. I suppose there are politicians who shoot at Gold Star families. I can't explain how that is possibly appropriate, but nor will I try. But for the most part, everybody, all politicians, all parties start pointing out how much they respect the military and how much they appreciate their service. And there's a big fight about various foreign adventures, but there is almost no fight about the men and women who are serving and their honorability. You're on mute, Karen.
Yes, sorry. I know that we've now had the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate. And do you have an opinion on how both of those debates may impact the 2020 races?
The presidential debate was a massive disaster for Donald Trump. The polling, talking to I don't know, Mary, if you participated, on Monday, we had the Wall Street Journal NBC pollster do a Zoom with 270 folks. And the polling just after like 2 or 3 days after the debate was so bad for the president. I mean, it showed the president has been like a 42, 43, 44 approval, like the narrowest trading band, and it went down to a 39. I mean, which is, for that, if that's all you ever moved, that was a huge hit. Everything bad about him came through. Joe Biden would tell you, I mean, Joe Biden, to his credit, jokes about himself, and he says Biden of himself says, I'm a gaffe machine. If you're running against the gaffe machine, hey, here's an idea, let him get a word in edgewise. Like, if the whole point is he's going to say something he's going to regret, and you don't let him say it, just tactically that makes no sense. But Trump has always taken a view of politics that is one of, you win by bullying, but it's a politics of division. And the people who have been successful have had politics of addition. Trump's not grown his base in terms of groups that support him. And in fact, he's been hurting. And so right now, the two groups he's been hurting worst with right now were suburban women and seniors. And if you think you're going to show suburban women and seniors that you should be the right person by continuously rudely interrupting somebody, by being a bully, no suburban women I know are impressed by that. Okay. I didn't mention, I'm sorry, Karen, also, you said vice presidential debate.
I did.
I think I might say The Fly won the vice presidential debate. Honestly, about 10 minutes into that, I just started thinking, when is this going to be over? I did not find either of them especially appealing. They both came off to me like politicians who dodge questions and who have pre-programmed spin and all. As a result, it's a net win for the Biden team because they're winning. So they just need to not lose the debates. And I'm sure there'll be some who will disagree with me. When I left, I didn't walk away thinking, wow, I love either Pence or Harris more than I did. I thought, man, this is why everybody hates Washington.
And I know that you've talked about it's hard to find common ground between the parties and even within the parties. Have you given any thought to how that can transfer or may transfer to jurors in the courts?
Boy, that's a great question. And I don't know, I can't believe that at the national level, your organization hasn't tried to figure out whether hyper-partisanship is something that either is exploitable or a risk. I hadn't thought about that before. Logically, you would think so. I mean, if you're in a jury trial, it's all about how do we appeal to you. pleading in the, I'm a lawyer and I started at a larger firm, but pleading in a courtroom is like lobbying. It's marketing. You know, in the case of a jury, it's 12 men or women. In the case of Congress, it's 435, but you know, each has their own background. So somebody who is liberal from an urban area is different than somebody who is rural and conservative. And you have to try to get an appreciation for how they think. It's hard to imagine, since we're seeing products trying to advertise and trying to market, leaning into a degree, generally a lot more leading in on the woke side, think Nike and Colin Kaepernick, than leading in on the right of center side, or at least you don't see that on TV as much. You probably do see that in a lot of places on the internet, between ads for precious metals and Bitcoin or something. I've got to believe that since the political tribe we belong to is increasingly more and more influential, that partisanship is indeed infecting how juries think and how they operate amongst one another.
What impact do you think the shift in Congress will have on small business owners, large and small?
What shift are you talking about, Karen?
A potential shift.
So I guess there are a couple of different questions. I mean, first, if the Democrats pick up the Senate, which super tight, Sabato 49-49, but if you told me I had to simply bet, I'd probably bet on the Ds a little more than bet on the Rs to be in the Senate majority. It then begs the first question, how are we going to deal with the filibuster rules? My own sense is there is a decent number of Republicans like Rob Portman or Senator Cornyn or Senator Thune who don't want to see the filibuster blown up, who are legislators and who will attempt to who will tell us every girl who will attempt to find common ground rather than force the Democrats' hand to say, look, we can't get anything done because McConnell's blocking everything, so we're going to blow up the whole filibuster. You start with, is the filibuster in place or not? If it's in place and if the Ds don't blow it up and the Rs don't play ball, Congress is pretty gridlocked at that point. If the Ds are able to move a lot of stuff, either by the filibuster or by Republican, so that's gridlock scenario. The next scenario is this group of middling Republicans says, you don't want to blow up the filibuster and we don't want you to blow up the filibuster, so let's find compromises. That's kind of what the founders designed. I actually tend to think that might lead to the best possible laws because it won't be all of what one party wants or all of what another party wants. It'd be incremental progress with the fringes really pissed off and upset and running for 2024. The last scenario is you blow up the filibuster. If you blow up the filibuster, if I'm the Democrats, I know that the fuse has been lit. I got 2 years till I probably lose the House. And so at that point, Katie bar the door. You asked about small businesses. Taxes for sure are going to go up. Vice President Biden has said on day one, he's going to, he said, this is classic Biden, on day one, I'm going to repeal, Trump's tax cuts and corporate tax is going to go back up to 28%. Now, it doesn't work that way. And he knows it doesn't work that way. And what Senator Harris was saying in the debate is, yeah, it wouldn't be true for anybody making under $400,000. Taxes will have to go up, and President Biden would want them to go up, though he's going to try to put a threshold of sorts. If your business earns more than $400,000 and you're a pass-through, your taxes are going to go up. He's more likely to be more regulatory minded. It sort of depends what sector you're in. Tech may not mind that so much. A law firm may not mind a lot of those things so much. In fact, the climate may be better. That may be good. I think enforcement's going to go way up. Whether it's the IRS or the FDA or the SEC. They're really the total amount of enforcement has been going down, and I do think one of the secular trends of the next decade will be a lot more enforcement. I think for the narrowness of AAJ, that's going to create opportunities. That's going to create a need and a chance to support a lot that's happening in government. I think for other businesses, that's going to create greater friction, greater costs, slow growth.
Okay. And I know you discussed that your term is EDS, MEDS, and FEDS were not prepared or digitized to flourish. How do you view this in terms of the courts and their preparedness?
So to be honest, I have been wonderfully not in the courts in the last couple of months, and all of the anecdotal evidence I get is from Salvatore Zambri, he of AAJ fame. It sounds like there was the early couple of months where it was, we were all locked down and they hadn't figured out how to leverage Zoom and other platforms, but it feels like from what, again, secondhand from your members, it feels like they're back up and running at a meaningful fraction of their prior speed. It's the whole economy is still part speed though, and as long as that's true, that undermines our ability, whether it's the administration of justice or the entrepreneurship and creativity that does make America great. And it doesn't feel like we're going to get on the other side of that until either we become really disciplined at dealing with social distancing, wearing masks, slowing things down, and not going to bars when bad things happening, which more or less is the opposite of America, or till we have a vaccine that's adequately distributed, and that may be 6 to 9 months. So hopefully courts are fully back by 2022.
Can I pop in here for just 1 second? Karen, sorry to steal it away from you, but I see before we wrap up, there's 2 more questions I just want to get in that are in the chat. Is that okay, Karen?
Yes, I didn't see them. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So question number 1 from Avery Adcock. In TV ads and advertisements everywhere, we are seeing larger companies and healthcare providers appeal to consumers by advertising that they are the heroes and staying open to get us the products we need. Do you think this is a changing perception, and how do you recommend we study how potential jurors view the companies we may be suing in the future?
Wow. So that's a great question, Avery. And I guess I would start with the acknowledgement that I'm betting most of those big companies whose ads you're seeing are clients of mine that I'm advising and that you guys are suing, which is fine because we're all friends. I think it's smart advertising. I think it's consistent with what you've seen forever. Is brands are always trying to appeal to improve their brand value. If you went 40 years ago and you looked at the market cap of a company, 80% of their market cap 40 years ago was tangibles like factory or inventory. Today, 85% of their brand are of their market cap is intangibles. That could include software and data, but it's also brand. It's also brand value. And it's a reason why Nike leans in on the Kaepernick ad, or Patagonia leans in against President Trump on the use of public lands. It's why businesses businesses led the charge and were the reason why in Texas and North Carolina, those bathroom laws that were fairly LGBTQ hostile, in the case of North Carolina, got repealed. In the case of Texas, never got passed. The red state legislators didn't care. They figured they had the votes to get reelected, but the business community weighed in. Some of that is they want to do the right thing, but a lot of that is the business community says if you want to attract and retain Gen Z and millennial employees, they're more inclined to work for a business that has purpose. If you want to appeal to consumers, associating yourself with positive things like social justice is a way to appeal to consumers and therefore improve your brand and your brand value. Increasingly, investors are judging potential investments by their carbon footprint. And we're in a world where activists, as a result of the fact that in a smartphone world, everybody can be a witness and everyone can be a publisher and everybody can be an activist, they're far more sensitive to it. Those same trends that impact their ability to get workforce, their ability to get consumers and investors and to not be beat up should, for all the same logical reasons, be protective armor of sorts for them when they're sued. With you guys, of course, what will happen is that means that the businesses that have figured it out right are going to go in with a higher net goodwill. Think Apple, think Amazon. That said, a given case isn't about their brand and the ads they ran per se. It's about the facts of the specific case. But if the companies take my advice and do it well, they're going to go into their scraps with you from a better starting position.
Okay, and last question is from your neighbor, Sal Zambri.
Hey.
He says, thank you for your fascinating presentation, and I do agree, it's been fascinating. If this election ends up as a blue wave and the Dems later pack the Supreme Court, what, if any, long-term political backlash do you anticipate?
So Roosevelt tried and couldn't because of the backlash at the time among senators of his own party as well as the other. Maybe if the Democrats were to do it, I guess a couple of things seem like they might happen. First, the Dems' likelihood of losing the House and losing the Senate in the first midterms would go up. I think as it is, remember, Trump lost the House in his first midterm, Obama lost the House in his first midterm, Clinton lost the House in his first midterm, Bush waited till his second midterm because 9/11 kind of gave him a goodwill in 2002. So they're already struggling. I think given the purple to sometimes red districts that they represent, they'd lose the House. As for the Senate, people like Senator Manchin may or may not go along with you from West Virginia. Same with Senator Sinema from Arizona. Certainly they would hear a lot of hostile blowback from their constituents. So to gain the extra justices, you might lose the House and the Senate is number one. Number two, what I wonder about though, is you do that, okay, the next time there is 50 Republican senators, Republican House and a Republican president, you've gone to 15 justices, they go to 30 justices. I mean, the good news, Sal, is one of these days you're going to end up on the Supreme Court because they're just looking for dudes. They need lawyers. But one wonders, where does it end, as we kind of saw with the filibuster where Harry Reid tried to pull one string and now it's, not just nominees, it's not just judges, it's also Supreme Court. And I feel like it shouldn't happen. But where I struggle is if the Dem House passes civil rights law, and once again, the filibuster is used as it was shamefully in American history to block civil rights laws that a majority want, and even a majority of the Senate's ready to pass, boy, I just don't think in this modern world you can keep a filibuster to allow the minority to stop basic civil justice. And so even if you try to narrowly pull it, which is more likely, rather than just saying, all right, filibuster's all dead, the Dems will come up with a rule. The filibuster's dead in certain types of legislation. But as we saw with judges, Republicans will just take that category and add another category and you're off to the races.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Bruce. And Karen, you did a fabulous job moderating this as well. And I thank you for your time. And so you're more than welcome to stay on, Bruce, and listen to the next speaker, but you probably have a few things to do, I would imagine. But thanks
for having me. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Okay, gang. So we are about to get started with our next presentation. Before we do so, I just want to announce that I did a secret raffle pull, and hopefully this person is still on the call, but let me see, is Andrew, yeah, Andrew Karp, you are the winner of the $200 gift certificate from Capital Healthcare. So congratulations to you. That's a fabulous weekend gift for you. And I'll get you the details on how to get that. And then without further ado, I'm going to turn over our last hour of the program over to Avery Adcock to introduce our next speaker.
All right, thanks, Mary. Well, next up we have John Campbell. John is an attorney, law professor, and founder of Empirical Jury, a company that uses online platforms and cutting-edge technology to perform case and jury analytics using big data. Now, unlike traditional focus groups, his company specializes in conducting online focus groups, which involve large numbers of participants from around the country. John is going to discuss how to utilize this big data in your practice today, as well as sharing his analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on jury attitudes, their behavior, and their willingness to serve. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for being with us today. I have to say that after listening to your podcast on Trial Lawyer Nation, I immediately started to rethink how I approach many of my cases, and was also very surprised at what I thought I knew about jury research generally, as well as my many misconceptions about who the perfect juror would be. So I can't wait to learn more about what you do and how we can utilize these theories to think differently about how we evaluate our cases from intake all the way to trial to maximize our overall client recovery.
Thanks, Avery. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here with you virtually. And it always feels weird when you get started because I can't see all of your faces, but I was looking at the list and I saw some familiar names. So it's good to be presenting to all of you. Just as a way of background, so that I think when you're listening to a speaker, you're going to know where they're coming from. My background is I started as a plaintiff's attorney in St. Louis, working for a firm called the Simon Law Firm, which John Simon is a wonderful trial attorney, is a member of the Inner Circle, and I was lucky to sort of get trained up in being a lawyer, both in how you do it and why we do it, from somebody who is still a personal hero. So that's my background. While there, I started running a class action department. And so I did some injury work, some business to business sort of interesting things, and then a lot of class work across the board. About 8 years ago, I joined the University of Denver, where I started as a professor, but also started bumping into people around campus who were doing research on all sorts of things. These were economists and social scientists and all sorts of people that were looking into how people act and why they do the things they do. But what became clear to me was that maybe some of the things they knew about how to study people would be useful for when we wanted to understand how jurors act. And so I set about trying to understand how they do what they do, how they're using technology to study people, and whether or not that had any application. My start was to do academic studies and publish those studies, and my hope was to study tort reform, what I viewed as myths, tort reform myths, and to maybe provide some data about whether or not some of the things we were hearing held up to actually when you studied them. That led to also studying a lot of other things, including some of my own cases. My wife's a trial lawyer, some of her cases. We sort of stumbled into beginning to study individual cases as well. And so today when I talk about this, I'll try to talk about maybe two things. The emerging field of jury research, which covers private studies where you're studying your own case, but also a lot of research that I would encourage you to look at that I think is useful that's coming out of the academic world. There's of course papers from the academic world that study how many angels fit on the head of a pin. I'm not asking you to read those, but there are also some really good studies that cover things like how per diem arguments work, how anchoring works, whether or not judges need to rethink what they allow in voir dire, things that you could cite to courts that are data driven. And so I'll try to cover a little of that today. My goal is to talk to you a little bit about the method of studying juries with big data, and then tell you a little bit about what we're learning about COVID, all with the focus. I know you're not going to trial right now. So also with the focus of talking about maybe how we can use some of this in our own cases. I continue to handle cases. My wife continues to handle cases. And we're trying to figure out how can we use data to drive cases to resolution if we can't get them set for trial. So I'll kind of try to talk through some of that. All right, with that said, let me share my screen and you can stop looking at me and we can start talking about some of what we're going to do today. Let me get it open. And here it is. Got it. All right. Looks like we're sharing our screen now. And let me put this in presentation mode and I'll just walk you through the first part of what we're going to talk about is how do we study juries if we're not studying them face-to-face? There's a couple of reasons you might not want to study a jury face-to-face, right? Or do a focus group face-to-face. One is that during COVID, it's getting increasingly hard. And all the things related to that, right? That you might get different kinds of people who are showing up. You might have real skew in who shows up. You might not be comfortable bringing them into your office. You may have your office closed. That's one reason, right? COVID has made us think about how we can study our cases and understand jury behavior and our cases better without having somebody in a room. The other thing is that, as I'll talk about, I think if you think about what's going on today in the 21st century, we have to ask the question about whether or not we should at least be adding to the way we think about studying cases, something that's a little more advanced than how we've done it for a long time. I'm not suggesting that doesn't have value, but if you think about Google, for example, Google does not try to figure out its next ad by bringing people into a room and talking to them, right? Google takes a different approach. It runs two ads, ad A and ad B, and it measures the click-through rate, for example. And then over a period of time, it decides which one was more effective. It pulls the bad ad and runs the good one. And then it tries to improve on that. If we think about medical studies, if we were bringing a claim against someone who put a medicine on the market, and they said, oh, well, it's okay, we know the medicine's safe, we studied it with 20 people. We would probably present that as evidence that they had not studied it appropriately. We would say, well, you need massive studies, right, of a medicine before you put it on the market. And you need a blinded study in which some people get it and some people don't. And you can compare the people who got it to the people who didn't. You use statistics to determine if the medicine is safe and effective. Well, what I would challenge today attorneys to think about is whether or not we should be thinking about cases a little more scientifically at times too. Whether it is possible for us to better understand cases using methods that exist in other fields. And so you can guess my answer. My answer is yes. So when we go through this, let me just talk about how we do it, and then what we're learning about COVID. And I'm going to try to leave a little time because there's always people who have questions, and I'd like to answer them. All right, let's see if we advance. Here we go. All right, so very briefly, the same tools that are used by social scientists, economists, all sorts of people are now being used to study juries. I'm not unique in this, although I think in the private sector, studying juries for attorneys, there's not much of that happening. There's some. In the academic world, there's a growing group of researchers who, when they study juries, are not using their students or groups of 20, but are using big data. We're also seeing this happen in jury research, which I'll just briefly mention, that we're seeing an evolution in how attorneys understand juries when they get the list of jurors, for example, and they need to know more about them. And then we're seeing sort of a general evolution in how people think about picking juries, including how they use technology at the stage where they're actually in the courtroom talking to jurors. I know that none of you are doing that right now, so I'm going to move past that pretty quickly. Or at least not many of you, unless you're trying cases in other jurisdictions. So how does this new way to study juries work, or where does it apply? We get called by attorneys around the country to work on cases all the way from before they're filed to decide whether or not investing the money makes sense, all the way through, believe it or not, every once in a while an appeal. And I'll talk through that more. But the idea is that sometimes there's a question in a case that could be answered. And if we can answer it, sometimes it helps the attorney make a better decision. If you're asking, if you're thinking about scope of work, we work only on plaintiff's cases in any sort of injury or individual setting. And then we work on some business to business and patent litigation cases when they're right. We work on some criminal defense cases when we think they're interesting. All right. Let's talk a little bit about how it works. So please, in this part, this will sort of make sense of the presentation. If you flip a coin 10 times, I think we all agree that you could certainly have it come up heads 2 out of the 10. Now, if you use that data, let's call that our sample. If we use that data, we would predict that the likelihood of getting heads is 20%, but we would be wrong. So what I want you to ask yourself is why? Why would we be wrong? Let's assume it's a fair coin. Let's assume that this is a real quarter. We did flip it 10 times. We got heads twice. Why is our estimate wrong? Why is 20% the wrong number? Well, we know it's supposed to be 50%, right? What I would tell you is the reason we're getting the wrong answer is because we didn't flip it enough times. With a small sample, we can get randomly wrong answers. Now, what happens if, and I'll click through this quickly, if we flip it more and more times, we get less and less likely to get a wrong answer. If we flipped it 350 times, we might get 180 heads. We might get 160, 172 heads, or we might get 195 heads. But what we wouldn't get is something that lets us predict 20%. So now we could predict, oh, it's somewhere around 52, 53, 58, 41, 48, somewhere close. Now, what if we did it 1,000 times or 2,000 times? You're starting to get the sense that as we flip it more and more, we will get closer to the actual estimate. So this is a simple principle. Big samples help us get more accurate answers because they take out the randomness that occurs when you don't measure something enough times. We know that when we study medicine. If we studied a medicine only 10 times, we could find it only helped 2 people. But we don't know that that would hold if we studied it 100 times or 1,000. I would suggest to you that it's the same when we talk to jurors, because we might only talk to 10 jurors and 2 of them mention something and we think, oh, it's not a very big deal, only 2 mentioned it. But what we don't know is how many times the next 10 and the next 10 and the next 10 would mention the idea. right? So we don't actually know the prevalence of the idea or the view or whether they'll vote for our client unless we talk to enough of them to sort of get a sense of where the big group is, not where this sort of random sample is. This is just a visual representation of how this might work. Let's say we have jurors come in and we ask them to award damages in a case after they watch the case. And we say, give us damages. On the bottom here, the x-axis, we're charting how many jurors we've talked to. And on the y-axis, if you remember back to those days, we're talking about damages, right? Up and down, the vertical axis is amount of awarded. What you'll see is just look at the line and look how it looks more like the Rocky Mountains, and then it starts to sort of flatten out. What we're seeing is that as we talk to more jurors and we take their input, how much would you award in damages? The individual numbers they give could be higher or lower than average, but as we get more of them, we get more of a true flat average. So early on, one juror giving $5 million could dramatically skew how we perceive the case. But if we have 200, the line starts to quiet down and we start to get to meaningful averages. The goal of big data is to get enough observation points that you get more accurate measures, all right? And we've always assumed that's true for other things. We haven't always assumed that's true for law. And what we're finding is in the academic world and also in individual case world, it is. I'm gonna skip this. All right, so the next question I always get is, all right, so you say we need lots of jurors. How do we get hundreds of jurors to review our case? How's that even possible? Well, Amazon and other companies have largely solved this problem for us. Amazon years ago started recruiting people to do individual jobs that Amazon didn't want full-time workers for. A silly example I always give is that they had people who would sort pictures between bats and birds. Don't ask me why Amazon needed to do this, I don't know. But they couldn't write an algorithm that would sort bats from birds. But they did figure out that people were pretty good at it. And they said, well, we don't want to hire full-time workers for this, but what if we paid people for an hour to look at these pictures and sort them? And what if we wrote a background algorithm that said, once so many of them agree, call that a bat, call it a bird. Then we'd use people, kind of a human neural network with a little bit of software background. So that's what they did. And they started using people on demand to do work. Since then, there are now hundreds of thousands in any given day, sometimes millions of people online who are looking for work they can do that day. They're not working for an individual company. They're going on to sites and looking for jobs. What are those jobs? They're usually not legal, all right? I mean, I don't mean they're illegal. They're not law related. They're usually jobs that have to do with reading something and reviewing it, providing opinions, believe it or not, about haircuts or fashion, looking at ads for a new drink. You know, anything that anybody can think they want opinions on, they figured out, hey, I can put this out and people can look at it, or anything that people need a group to work on. You can imagine if you throw 10 people at a document, have them all edit it, and then take all their collective edits, it's been cleaned up pretty good, right? And so these are called, what are often called human intelligence tasks, or HITs. So if you went on Amazon now and signed up as a worker, you could go on and you would find a list of hits. There'd be hundreds or thousands of them in any given day. And what you're trying to figure out is which ones do you want to do? You look at how long they are and how much they pay, and you decide if you want to do them. Sometimes there's qualifications, sometimes there aren't. We get workers from these sites. And what that means is that in any given day, we can find tens of thousands of people that could look at a case. All right, who are these jurors? I won't walk through all this because of the kind of time we have, but what I will say is that what we find is that if we take a big sample from one of these sites, these jurors are basically a national sample, right? Their average income is very close to national averages. Their ages range from 18 to 70 plus. Their education spans everywhere from not finishing high school to graduate degrees. Male and female is pretty evenly mixed. We get a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds. And if you looked at other demographics, if you said blue collar versus white collar, if you said Republican versus Democrat versus independent, if you said Trump supporter or not, we see what looks like a pretty national spread. So you can get a really good sample. People always ask at this point, well, all right, can you also target areas? Can you get jurors that look like your demographic profile for your panel? Sure, that's possible. The point here being that there are a lot of people out there from all walks of life doing studies. How can we make sure the data is meaningful? The next question I always get, so I sort of try to answer it early, is all right, who are these people? I mean, I'm not sure. At least when I have somebody sitting in a conference room and I'm talking with them, I know they're real and I can look at them and hear their answers. How do I know that somebody who watches something online and provides feedback is real? Well, what we do, at least, everybody has their own approaches to this, but in the academic world and when we're studying cases at Empirical Jury, what we do is we embed a series of attention checks. So if you took a study and you were going through a case presentation, you would be entering information about yourself. Maybe the 8th question would say, click the 3rd answer that starts with an M to show your reading. If you're just clicking through as fast as you can to finish the work and get your money, you miss that and you're thrown out. We would also ask you things about yourself, right? We want to know your gender. We want to know your age. We want to know your income. We want to know if you own a gun. We want to know what you want to watch on what you watch on TV. There's a lot of things we want to know about our jurors so that then later we can use that to see if anything's predictive. Well, when you're done answering those questions, we'll put you on a new page. You don't see your old answers, and we'll say, repeat these 5 answers. Do you have a gun? Do you live in a rural, suburban, or urban area? How many kids do you have? Things like that. If people can't give that basic information, again, we throw them out. So what happens is, and then when we present the case to them, of course, we give them some comprehension questions to make sure they read, to make sure they watched video, to make sure they looked at images, however it's presented. If people miss those, we throw them out. What we end up getting is we get jurors who paid attention, gave us real information, and so now we have real people giving us real feedback. The difference is, since we can get them online, since we can use them only for the time we need them, we can get more of them at a reasonable cost because we're not bringing them into our office. We're not buying them Danish. We're not killing time while there's bathroom breaks. We're showing them the case, and we're only using the people who are paying attention. We check for bias. So we ask jurors, for example, who do you think sponsored? If they're watching a case that we're presenting to study, we want to know who do you think sponsored the study? We might give them something like this and ask them to tell us. And then we know, all right, are people overwhelmingly thinking the defense sponsored this study or the plaintiff? If we see, for example, that 80% of jurors think the plaintiff sponsored the study, we might have a problem. Because if the plaintiff did sponsor the study and jurors are guessing that, the materials are likely unfair. All right, so let's talk about applications of real world problems. So just to make sure this is clear, because it's always hard when you're not getting feedback or questions. What we're doing is we're taking the case just like you would show it to a focus group, plaintiff and defense case, but now we're presenting it online to a lot more people who are proving to us they're real people, then watching the case, then telling us how they would vote and why, right? That's the bottom line. And then we're taking that data and running it through a lot of different ways that you can analyze data using statistical methods and trying to learn everything we can, from how strong the case is to how much it's worth to what the fault allocation is, all these sorts of things. So now let me get to some applications to real world problems, including a lot of applications that don't have to do with trying the case. All right, so let me talk to you a little bit about academic stuff. I mentioned that there are academic papers using big data approaches. This is one I was involved in. I was the lead author on this paper, but I want to mention it here because a lot of trial attorneys find it useful. And that is that we worked with Lee Ross from Stanford, Valerie Hans from Cornell, and Jessica Salerno from Arizona State University on a study that examined, do jurors show up to court with bias? The answer, of course, we all kind of knew was yes, but the question was, all right, well, what kind of biases and who do they favor? So we studied 2,500 jurors across 3 different civil case presentations. These are all real cases that we used to present to the jurors. And what we were looking for was, do they express biases and do those biases affect how they vote? What we found was, not entirely surprisingly, for example, if jurors believe the burden of proof is too low for plaintiff's attorneys, they often vote in a way that is less favorable to the plaintiff, even if they say that they can be fair, and even if they say they'll follow the rule as written, right? Once they think, you know, I think the plaintiff should have to do more work to prove their case, they behave differently than if they don't believe that. What we did was, when people said that, half of them then saw a judge who said, in a robe, can you take that bias and set it aside and be fair? And jurors would often say, sure, absolutely, I can be fair, as we all know. So they faced rehabilitation, which we've all seen in court. What the study ends up saying, in sort of a nutshell, is jurors come in with bias. That bias tends to run against the plaintiff at a ratio of about 3 to 1, all right, which a lot of us have suspected. This proves. If you just look at the basic questions, for example, the burden of proof question, there's over 20% of jurors who think the burden of proof is too low for plaintiffs, There's only about 5% who think it's too high, right? Well, what happens when we leave those people on a jury if we're in a federal court that doesn't allow voir dire or or a court that rehabilitates jurors? What we know is that those jurors disproportionately vote against the plaintiff. And they don't just do it on liability, they do it on damages, they do it across the board. Now, the cure to that has often been, well, you can rehabilitate them. So we rehabilitated half the jurors with real video from a judge. And what we found is it didn't change their votes at all. We can say with data that rehabilitation doesn't work. The interesting thing is jurors who were rehabilitated and jurors who weren't were asked afterward, did your predispositions, your own biases affect your decision? And the only thing rehabilitation did was make them even more blind to whether or not their biases influence their decisions. So why do I mention this? This is an example of an academic paper. I sponsored this paper at the University of Denver Law School. But it's a paper that could be cited to an open-minded judge to say, look, judge, we need real voir dire because there are people with biases. Those biases affect how they vote. And it cannot simply be cured by either assuming everybody's fair, which is not true, or saying to everyone, can you please follow the instructions as given? It's simply not a solution. A lot of us know that, but our goal was to provide some data so that judges who will listen, either in judicial college or in individual cases, can rethink the way they approach this question. I'm going to skip this for the sake of time, and this too. All right, let's talk about big data studies in individual cases, because I know most of you are probably thinking about the cases you've got in front of you, whether they're going to move, especially with a limited or no trial settings. So let's talk about some of the things we can learn about cases, and then I'm going to turn quickly to how you can use that, at least potentially you can use big data to maybe move some cases. All right, let me talk about this one because I think this is maybe one of the biggest misconceptions. And when I talked with Avery the other day, I think she mentioned this one, and I know I hear it pretty often. We've all been told that when you study a case through a focus group or however you go about it, that you cannot predict case value. That was the prevailing wisdom. That's what I was raised up on. I wanted to talk through that because what we do in our studies is we present robust damage cases for the plaintiff and whatever the defense is going to do. They're going to challenge life care plans. They're going to suggest that the plaintiff is malingering. They're going to suggest that there's a shortened lifespan, which would reduce the damages. If they're going to challenge the discount rate, whatever they're going to do, we present the defense case as well. And then we have jurors not only decide liability, but award damages. And we make them award specific damage numbers for the categories, whether there's eco and non-eco or just non-eco, whether non-eco is broken down. And what I can tell you is that we've had a bunch of cases go to trial over the last 3 or 4 years. And what we're finding is that if we ask enough people what they'll do with damages, and then we look at the average, and we also look at sort of the range that the middle sort of hunk of jurors. And what I mean by that is if you think about all the jurors from low to high value, take out the top 25%, take out the bottom 25%, and what you'd have in the middle is this slice of the middle, the most sort of middle of the road jurors. What we found is that predicts the range of verdict, and that the average award is very close to what jurors actually give in trials. And that makes some sense, right? Because what we know is that jurors go in, they spit out a number of different numbers, and then they start to deliberate. Sometimes they say, well, you said a number that's so crazy high, and they throw it out. And then they start to not necessarily average in a way that's impermissible, but they certainly start to move towards either the middle or sort of an average of their positions. So if we get enough sample in online jury studies and big data jury studies, we're finding we can predict value. Now, the first one I have on this list, we don't always get this close, but we recently worked on a case, and I'll come back to this case because it's a sort of a bright spot in what we're learning. Is we recently worked on a medical malpractice case in Pennsylvania. It was in a rural county outside Pittsburgh. It was a medical malpractice case that targeted a first responder. First responder was a defendant. He was an ER doctor. Another doctor was a defendant. He was a radiologist. And then the hospital was also a defendant. And the whole theory was that a man had an allergic reaction to a CT scan, and the ER doctor, the radiologist, and the hospital did not respond appropriately. And he ended up having hypoxic brain injury. Well, we studied that case, and we predicted a case value of $10.89 million. Now, that wasn't just what plaintiff jurors gave. That was after we counted the bad jurors that voted for the defense. That was after we considered any fault issues, and after we adjusted for any skew in the materials, because a few more people thought the plaintiff wrote the case. When we adjusted, we thought the case was worth 10.89 million. The verdict was 10.8 million. Now, are we always going to be within a few $1,000s? No. But what I would tell you is that the idea that you can't value cases is not holding up. The people who are studying cases with big data are finding that we can have a very good range of where cases are going to come in. Just as a couple more examples, so you don't take my word for it. We had another case where we thought that the average award would be 10.1 million. And we also predicted that the overall fault to the plaintiff and his employer, which would discount the verdict, was 24.8%. In that case, the verdict was 13.3. So we were low, but the attorney actually ended up asking for a few more $1 million. So I don't feel too bad about that. And the fault was 26%. We missed the fault by 1.2%. We had another case where we thought the case was worth 32.1 million. And my screen is hiding it because I've got a box here. And the verdict was 37. So we were low. We were more than 10% off. But again, if you can imagine a range, we didn't say it was worth 12 million or 50 million, right? Another case recently where we predicted 1.7 and the verdict was 1.3. So I've tried to pick not just our best examples, but also examples where we missed. But as you can see, you're missing by 10, 15% in many circumstances. And I think a lot of people thought that wasn't possible because, of course, that means if we could do that, jumping ahead a little bit, that means if we can predict case values, you could study a case and take the data to mediation and show a judge that's mediating or whoever your lawyer that's mediating is, or however you're handling mediation in that case, that you've studied your case, that you've given the other side their best day, that you presented their case robustly, that you're not using your gut, but that you're relying on what 2, 3, 4, 500 jurors said, and that you have a sense of how often you win, what the fault will be if fault's an issue, and what the range of awards is. And we're seeing that with our clients and in our own cases work, because we're saying to the mediator, look, I don't care if the other side says it's worth $1 million. We studied the case, we presented real evidence, we presented real videos of real witnesses, we used real damage models, we used real life care plans, we gave the defense all the evidence it thinks will come in, and our data says this case is worth $2.2 million. Look, we acknowledge that there are days that we get less, but there are days we get more, and we can show you how often those happen. This is the average. This is a fair settlement. Now, the defendant can pay a fair settlement, or if they don't want to, that's okay, but we should try the case because our data says that we will do better at trial than we would do settling it there. And what that does is, of course, the mediator sometimes, once they're familiar with the data, has that, and they have to think, well, which is more likely, that 300 jurors' opinions are valid or that the defense attorney's gut is valid? The second thing, of course, is that for the defense attorney, if they learn about this data, if you allow it to be shared in a smart way, they would have to recommend not settling a case at an average value and instead say, I think we should hold out for our best day. And if you go to trial and they lose, it is not a great position to be in, as all of you can imagine, to have told your client, don't pay 2.2 million, hold out, and then you get a verdict against you for 4, right? Especially if you had a report staring you in the face that said, this is an average day, they're not being unreasonable. So we've seen an increase, especially during COVID, of using big data to try to push cases that otherwise won't settle because they're not set for trial, and try to give them a reason to understand the value. We, of course, also, all of us have relationships sometimes with defense attorneys who say, look, I kind of agree with you, but I need you to help me with my client or the insurance adjuster, right? Because I think you're right, we have some exposure in this case, but they don't want to pay what you want. Sometimes providing them a report that they can use to go back to the insurance adjuster or to their client or both, sometimes that'll move the needle. All right, moving on from that for a minute, let me just talk a little bit about the kinds of things we can study in cases and why I at least find them interesting. On the left, and I think you can see my cursor, but on the left box here, you'll see a green box, an orange box, and a purple box. What we did here in this case, this is a big case. What we did in this case is the jurors all saw the exact same case, but they saw a different amount requested for damages. Okay, so imagine they see an hour-long presentation of evidence, and the only thing that changes is whether they're asked for a different amount, right? Whether it's 20 million or 50 million or 100 million or whatever it is. This is a big case. What we're doing then is we look at those 200 jurors that saw the low request and the medium request and the high request. And what are we doing? We're asking, do we see any changes in how much jurors give? Do we see any changes in the awards? Also, do we see any changes in fault or liability? And what we're trying to figure out is, on net, what's the best approach to this case? Many of us before, I know I have, I've been on the day before you're going to give a closing or the morning of closing or maybe 10 minutes before the closing, still trying to decide what number I'm going to say out loud. Because I don't want to say a number that people choke on, but I also don't want to go too low, right? I want to ask for a real number. Well, what we've been doing in our own cases and in others is we've been trying to study more scientifically what number is most effective. How high can we go before jurors push back against us? So if you look at the box on the right, top right, what you'll see here is that the high demand, if we look at this is the percentage of jurors who voted for liability. When we just say who wins, plaintiff or defense. And what you'll see is that the high demand has a real problem, which is that only 53% of jurors voted for the plaintiff. The medium demand 63% and the low demand 65%. This is a clear trend, right? That as you raise the request, you see what we would sometimes call, Avery and I were talking about this too, about the fusion effect, which means that jurors don't decide liability in isolation and then think about damages. The two interrelate. So here we see that as I ask for more, for any number of reasons, maybe they think I'm greedy, maybe I'm losing credibility, but what's happening is some jurors are not just giving me less money because they don't like what I said or disregarding my request. They're actually voting against me on liability, right? Well, that's dangerous, right? If you don't test this and then you go ask for the big number and you lose 12% of all jurors, you could lose the case on how much you asked for. So we've made it an approach that in most cases, we're studying this and trying to find what we call affectionately the Goldilocks zone, right? We're trying to find the sweet spot. It's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. That's what we're looking for in cases. That's how we maximize the anchoring effect, the value that we can pull jurors up to, but we're also considering how often are they voting for liability. All right, how about this? Everybody's had one of these, right? And you might have this right now, even if the case won't go to trial right now, you might have this, which is, all right, I've got two defendants in the case. One of them wants to pay some money to get out. Can I let them out, or am I going to face an empty chair? Are jurors going to say, well, I really think they're the one who's liable, I'm going to lose the case, or bleed a lot of fault to them, or what's going to happen depending on your, which venue you're trying it in. Sometimes you have non-party at fault, sometimes you don't. And I know some of you have multi-state or even national practices. But the bottom line is we all worry about this question. If I settle out one defendant, can I try it against the other, or have I lost the case at that point? So this is a medical malpractice case from a couple of years ago, and sort of a friend of mine who's a great lawyer came to me and said, look, I got a bunch of money on the table from one of the doctors, but I'm really worried that if I settle out that doctor, I don't know if I have a fighting chance against the other one. So what we did was we studied the case where you keep, the blue line is, what if you keep both defendants in the case? And what we found is that 69% of jurors vote for liability against at least one of the two doctors, meaning you recover. And then we ran it where we said, all right, assume the one is settled out, and we study the case with just the remaining doctor. Well, what do we find? We found that when you do that, the win rate fell to 42%. So what was the phone call I had with my friend, a great lawyer? I said, listen, if you're going to settle out that other doctor, it better be enough money for the whole case, because our data says you're going to lose if you try it against the remaining doctor. All right? You're only getting 42% of jurors voting for you. That's not enough. In deliberation, if you're already behind, could you flip them? I mean, it could happen. Is it going to happen often? No. You're going to lose. So the money they're offering you better be the total value of this case. Now, how do you know if it's enough? Well, we looked at, all right, in the case where you have both defendants and you win 69% of the jurors, which is a pretty good number, you're winning 7 out of 10 jurors, you probably are going to win that in deliberation. How much is the case worth? What's the average award? And it was simple. We could say, all right, if you keep both in, we think the case is worth X. How much are they offering? Is it more or less than X? And in that way, it reduced the settlement decision to a pretty simple question. Are they offering enough to make it worth settling the case, knowing that the case is probably over? Or is trying the case the more valuable approach for your client? That was it. As it turns out, he decided not to settle the case because they weren't offering enough money, and tried the case, got a great verdict by keeping both doctors in. I think if he had taken the money and tried the case, he would have almost certainly lost against the remaining doctor and would have made less money for his client and for himself than he did in this approach. All right, moving on. Let's skip that. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time to get to COVID and questions. This one's fun. People always find this interesting. I've anonymized the name, but in watching the videos of Kelly Davis, I believe his testimony. The background on this is pretty simple. I went and met with 2 attorneys, partners at a firm, one male, one female. The male attorney said, I believe that we will win this case because our client, Mr. Davis, is a wonderful witness. And this was a legal malpractice case. And so he's going to explain how he was misled and why he relied on that advice. He's a good looking guy. He was a high school quarterback. Everybody's going to like him. That's what I'm hearing. The other partner, the female attorney, looks and says, you must be crazy. I don't like him. He's a jerk. And everybody who sees him on the stand is going to hate him. Well, that's a problem, right? We have 2 people in the room. Both of them know their client. Both of them know him as a witness. One of them thinks he's great. One of them thinks he's terrible. Who's right? So here's what we did. We studied the case. We presented the whole case. And in that case, we showed video of Mr. Davis testifying. And then we asked jurors, do you find him credible? Do you believe his testimony? So let's look. Here's agree. 28% of participants agreed that he was believable. 55% thought he was not. So first thing, if you're betting on this, the second attorney won the bet. She was right. Over half of jurors don't believe him. Now, the next question we asked was, does it matter? So let me show you some charts. Skip over here to these green lines. This is the win rate versus the average. When people believe him, the agree line, you're 78% more likely. And in fact, if you look at this gray box, 90% of jurors voted for liability. Now look down here though. Look at the red box here. When people did not believe him, that's 55% of all jurors. Only 23%, that's this number, the win rate, only 23% voted for the plaintiff. That was a huge reduction both in win rate, which is this, and in case value. And so what we were able to say is, first of all, over half the jurors don't believe him. Second of all, when they don't believe him, it crushes your case, destroys it. Now, how is that practical advice? Well, it's practical advice because, as it turns out, his wife also had a claim for legal malpractice because they were co-owners of the business. And she was very likable when we tested her. And so she could testify primarily. He could be on the stand much less time. Instead of using him as a star witness, he became a secondary witness, right? We learned that by getting enough jurors to get what is the most likely response. People often wonder, other things we can learn. People wonder how many jurors are in play, meaning, is this a case where I can persuade people, or is this a case that divides people based on their belief systems? So we always ask jurors, how sure are you of your verdict? Here, the red bars are defense jurors. Well, you can see that almost half, in fact, about half of defense jurors are either somewhat sure or unsure, meaning half of all defense jurors don't feel great about their decision. They're not sure they're right. They're in play. Look at the plaintiffs, though. This is great. If you see this, if I ever send you a report and it's this, you'll be happy. The vast majority, right, about 275 or so plaintiff jurors, and over 200 of them are absolutely sure. If they report that they're absolutely certain of their decision, we can assume, and we've seen this play out, they're less likely to change their mind. Now, I've had to give bad news sometimes. Sometimes the plaintiff is behind in the case, or it's a very close case, and every defense juror is sure. The bar is very high. And what we have to say is, look, I'm not sure, even if you reframe this case, even if you do some good lawyering, how many of these people you can move because they're locked in. Maybe we need to talk about settlement, right? That helps us think about whether good lawyering is going to make a difference, whether another deposition will make a difference, or whether we need to cut bait and settle the case. We talked about that. We studied whether the materials were balanced. Let me just give you an example of other things that you can learn that would be useful. So we talked about you can use these for mediation. We also do in our own cases and with others, a lot of times we're studying cases to try to understand them during discovery. And that helps us think about what to focus on. So let me give you an example. I'll have to give you a little bit about this case, but it'll take maybe 5 minutes, or I'm sorry, 30 seconds, not 5 minutes. This is a case where the doctor made a mistake during surgery. He cut an artery. And I think the evidence was pretty clear that was likely negligent. But the argument by the defense was, this is a complicated surgery and it can happen. There was also evidence that the doctor never followed up with the patient and that afterward the doctor just went home, didn't seem to show any concern for whether the patient was recovering. And there was good evidence that if the doctor had followed up, even if there was a mistake during surgery, it likely could have been mitigated or the damages could have been eliminated entirely by good follow-up. Well, look, when we asked jurors who voted for liability what they cared about, these are all jurors who voted for the plaintiff. We said, what was the number one reason you did that? The number one reason was that the doctor did not properly follow up. Way down here is that he cut an artery. It's the third issue. Well, why would this be nice to know? Well, look, it's a harder case to prove that cutting the artery was negligent. There's some good medical literature that it happens. But it's an easier case to prove that even if that mistake is forgivable, failing to care about your patient isn't. And jurors like that case better. So if we knew this before our experts, maybe we'd have a talk with our experts about where they focus their time. Maybe instead of talking about the artery so much, they would say, look, I don't think you should have cut the artery. That was negligence below the standard of care to a reasonable degree of expert certainty. But he would have gotten away with it if he had done what he was supposed to post-op, right? And here's all the things that happened post-op that were negligent. Well, if we could spend our time there, we have data that suggests that makes for a better case. So a lot of times what we're trying to do is understand what jurors are thinking and why they're doing what they're doing so that then we can align ourselves better with them. And so we're not tilting at windmills. Jury analytics, I'm going to mostly skip because, look, we're not trying cases right now as often as we all would like. But the bottom line is when you get to juries, we often look backward and do what's called a regression analysis. And what we're asking is, all right, the average is 70% of jurors vote for liability and the average is $1 million. Let's take easy numbers. Are there subgroups of jurors who vote, say, higher than 70% or give more than $1 million or both? And using statistical methods, is that real? Is that statistically significant? When it is, we call it out. So for example, in this case, just as an example, you would see that parents, if you look at this list, parents were 11% more valuable in this case. Well, that's not nothing. I mean, if you have $1 million case and you could seat a bunch of parents instead of non-parents because you know this, if you squeeze out an extra $100,000 in the case just in selection, that's not bad, right? And we look at this a lot of different ways, what people watch on TV, whether they're gun owners, their political orientation. What are we trying to do? We're trying to give people lots of data points so that then when they have voir dire, if you're allowed to in your jurisdiction, do background research on jurors, if you have jury questionnaires, if you have jury intake forms, you're trying to figure out the jurors who are best for you. I always say, look, it's like taking a hand of blackjack that's 15 and we're trying to make it 18. Could you still lose an 18 hand? Yes, but you'll lose it less often, right? We're trying to improve the odds of winning and the amount you win. That's how we know how to help out the client. I don't want to, this is not meant to be a brag, but I think if I'm talking to you about a method, it has to be validated, or I'm a data guy. If it's not validated, you should throw it out. In the first 3.5 years or so that we've been doing this, because we stumbled into this, I'm a trial attorney and I wanted to understand my cases better. My wife's the same. But since that, we've been sort of invited to come out and do things like this, and we end up working on cases around the country. And we've been involved in a little over $500 million in verdicts, about 535 million, I think, as of the last verdict. And they've been on all types of cases all around the country. And so what I would say is the attorneys do the really hard work. They try the cases, but our goal is to try to figure out how to give them information that helps. I'm going to skip through. We have an app for those who, when we get back to trying cases, we have an application that we built because we got asked to come out and help pick juries. And we didn't want to use Excel sheets or sticky notes anymore. And so we built an application. Luckily, we have a computer programmer on that's part of our team. We built an application that lets you build jurors, score jurors, keep notes, sync with other people on your team in real time, upload all those notes, and use them as you're trying to collect all that information. We all know that's kind of helter-skelter, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I kind of think I almost forget what one of the jurors told me after I've talked to them. Of course, it depends on what jurisdiction you're in and how much time you get. Sometimes the problem is you don't get enough information. If you have questions about this part, john@empiricaljury.com, john@empiricaljury.com. With that said, let me just talk to you a little bit, and I'm going to leave time for questions, so this will be pretty quick. Let me just talk to you a little bit about COVID, because that's what's keeping us out of court. It's also what we're all wondering about what it's doing. So I'm going to skip a couple because this sort of assumed that maybe you haven't heard the first part of this talk. The bottom line is we're using the scientific method, right, to answer questions about cases, and here we're doing it about COVID. So we were wondering about a few things. How is COVID affecting who shows up? How is it affecting how jurors vote? What does that mean about jury selection, jury trials, and potential outcomes? All right, jury selection. Let me just give you a few data points. You know some of this, but let me put numbers on it. And by the way, if any of you are on task force or commissions about returning to trial, I'm working with attorneys in several states on this. I'm happy to share this information because I think whenever we go back to trial, we're going to need, I believe we're going to need procedures that are informed by data. All right. Who's likely to come? What's a safe way to pick juries? All that kind of stuff. All right. So what do we know? Jurors are afraid. 3 out of 4 jurors report that they're nervous about attending specifically due to COVID. Now, what does that say? I mean, you might say, well, okay, I imagine they'd be nervous. How about this? There are some judges who had proposed in various states that if people express anxiety about attending, they should be excused because we just can't force anybody to do this right now that's uncomfortable. What I would say is if you do that, you're going to lose 75% of all jurors out of the chute. Could that present some real problems for who shows up? You bet. Could that skew our entire panel? Yes. A higher number than usual will actively avoid. 46% of jurors said, I will work to use COVID as a way to avoid jury duty or find any way I can. Now, there's always a percentage of jurors, but half is high. Interestingly, 9%, it'll be higher in some jurisdictions and lower in others, but nationally, 9% would refuse to wear a mask. And so this is the other side of that. There's people who are scared to be there because of COVID. There's also some people who say, well, I'm not going to sit in a room with a mask for hours per day. I'm not willing to do that. Some of those people won't be on the jury either. So you can already imagine that. Just look at these numbers and think, if you called 40 jurors, how many are you going to lose just on COVID screening? Right? I mean, we could be talking about well over half. What we're seeing around the country in places where they are trying cases is judges are erring on the side of exclusion. Well, what kind of exclusion? Well, at a minimum, a lot of judges are saying if you have health factors that make you at risk for COVID, uniquely at risk, you're older, you're obese, you have diabetes, you have heart problems, lung problems, or you come in close contact regularly or live with someone who does, most judges are saying, look, I'm going to exclude those people. I can't risk their lives. That's about 40% of the panel. What does that mean? Well, whenever we get back to trying cases, I think even if we're in a world with some vaccine, with some immunity, we're probably still going to need larger panels because we're probably not going to be totally out of the woods. And hopefully a lot of us are going to get back to trying cases while there's still some COVID just because we can't wait years, right? We probably can't wait years to try cases. How does COVID impact panel composition? Well, interestingly, jurors who report that they're not nervous about COVID and believe the reaction to COVID has been exaggerated. These are people who say, look, we should just get on with our lives. I'm not afraid of COVID. I'm not scared. They reduced the win rate for plaintiffs by 16%. So if there's any silver lining here, if you're in DC and you're not having trials right now, is this. When people call me and say, should I go to trial? The judge has said we can. Should I? I've had to say to them, the panel that shows up is likely going to skew against you. If your judge is not going to allow you to have aggressive and lengthy voir dire, and you have to see mostly kind of who's there with a few peremptories, I think you're actually reducing your chance of winning versus what it was before COVID. And so the only thing I would say is that if you have to be shoved into trial, but there's not proper procedures, it'd be better to wait if you can. And I know that's saying a lot because all of us don't want to wait a year or two to resolve cases. But there are some risks to trying cases if there aren't proper procedures. I think with proper procedures and judges who understand the issue, as we've seen in some jurisdictions, plaintiffs can get good verdicts. But you have to have some real voir dire. You have to have pre-screening for COVID issues. You have to have some things in place. Jurors who've been sick with COVID are better for the plaintiff. I think that effect will start to disappear as we know more and more people are sick. I suspect it will, but for now, that's where it is. People often wonder, well, will they blame me as a plaintiff's lawyer for pursuing the case? The answer is they don't blame the plaintiff any more than the defense, and really who they blame most is the court. So the judge can take the heat on this one. This obviously has some troubling constitutional implications. Again, if you're thinking, I know all of you are thinking about getting back to trial, and you may be involved in discussions formally or informally, directly or indirectly with decision makers. What are we seeing around the country, and what would I say? Well, I mean, obviously we're doing witnesses by video. I think in the better venues, we're seeing witnesses wear face shields and be distanced, but that way you can see their face. I mean, I was just talking the other day with somebody trying a case, and they called during a break and they wanted to talk through an issue. And I said, how's the jury look? And they said, I have no idea. They're all in masks. I can't tell if they like my case or not. You can imagine if you're a juror and you're watching a witness and you can't see their face, you can only see their eyes. It's pretty hard to tell whether they're telling the truth or not. And so if we can get clear face shields allowed in these courts, my opinion is it's probably better for jurors, and they feel more like they can make an educated decision. Of course, we all have heard around the country about they're trying cases in auditoriums, lobbies, the jury assembly rooms that are bigger downstairs, anything that they can figure out. We're seeing selection in many cases in small groups. The judge will say, hey, you're going to work with 8 jurors because that's all we can fit. And then after we exclude and keep any of those, we'll go to the next. Or we'll at least do exclusions for cause and then set those aside and then do some more until we got enough to do strikes, peremptory strikes. Electronic exhibits because people are uncomfortable with you handing them stuff. Larger panels, pre-screening. For COVID, I would strongly recommend that you need questionnaires to get rid of the people that are obviously not going to be able to sit, so you don't risk busting a panel. And you don't risk a judge trying to save bad jurors just to save the panel. And then I think we can provide you, I'll be glad to give to any of you the paper that suggests that voir dire is always necessary. And here I would suggest, if anything, even more. All right. I was asked to talk a little bit about this. I'll mention it briefly because this relates to COVID, and then I'll wrap up. Med-mal studies. We took 2 cases that we had studied in the past, meaning we had a real robust, real case in a court and a client who'd asked us to help them understand that case and figure out how to try it. And then we had that same case, and we ran it in May and June of this year after COVID was on the scene and a little bit after the initial shock had at least passed, so that we weren't in March or April. And what we did was we didn't change a thing. And so our thought was, if we see different numbers, then it's likely due to COVID. So I'm not going to go through these in length. One case was a pretty clear liability case. The doctor basically screwed up a biopsy, and the post-op biopsy showed there was no cancer, but by then there had been a double mastectomy. The doctor should, of course, call and say, I made a mistake. This doctor instead called and said, good news, we got it all, you won't need chemo. And so this was a cover-up. So this was a case that had punitive potential and clear liability. Another case had to do with a newborn baby. It was a birth trauma case. And the question was whether or not this baby was born with some brain damage because of a stroke, which was the defendant's position, or because of head trauma from improper use of vacuum that caused hemorrhaging, which was the plaintiff's position. It's a very close case on the medicine. And as a result, it was a very close case with jurors. So look at the first case. The win rate pre-COVID was 98%. When we ran it again, the win rate was 93%. That 5% difference, even with the sample we had, was not statistically significant. So I'm not even sure it's a difference. But if it is a difference, it's not massive. Oops. In the vacuum case, we actually saw the win rate go up 1%. All right. So the takeaway here, because we're a little tight on time, is this. When we've studied medical malpractice cases, we're not seeing evidence that the defendant wins more often. And I'll just briefly mention why. Oh, no, I guess I won't. It didn't have it in here. I'll just mention why without the picture. I had a picture, I guess I took it out. People have asked, well, why is it that there's not more med mal verdicts for the defense since doctors are being portrayed as heroes? And I'll just mention, some of us saw on the news this picture of Trump protesters in trucks and cars asking to be let out during the confinement, during the time that a lot of people were confined to their homes mostly. And the people who stood in front of those cars were in doctors' outfits. They were in scrubs. They were either protesters or real nurses or doctors. So now ask yourself, who do progressive jurors align with? The people in the cars or the doctors? And the answer is, of course, that progressive jurors have viewed doctors as acting as heroes during COVID. But who do the Trump supporters align with? Well, they've actually become increasingly upset with doctors and with medical professionals and scientists. And we've seen that happen. And so the interesting thing is, in one of the medical malpractice cases we ran, people who openly supported President Trump voted for liability against doctors more than people who didn't. We've never seen that result before. And so what's happening now is that COVID, as unpredictable as it is, and its path is, it's sort of unpredictable what it does to jurors too. But what I would say is in the med mal setting, it's actually washing out a little bit. Some progressive jurors who used to be good for us, who cheered for the underdog, now are viewing doctors as heroes because of the media coverage and the work that they're seeing. But some Trump supporters who used to just hate all lawsuits and said, this is another McDonald's case, are now seeing a doctor that they don't like as much as they used to. They've lost their shine. And so what that means is that in med mal cases, we might have to rethink who we seat. But if we do that, and if we study the cases appropriately, they are winnable. All right. So the silver lining in the distance is when these cases are tried, I think that they have value as they always did. It just takes us rethinking and being flexible in how we try them. In the short term, hopefully you can use information and data in some creative ways to get cases either prepared for trial for all of us that are sort of working up all the cases and getting them ready for when there will be trial, and understand better what to focus on, and or use that data to push in mediation to get them resolved without a trial. And with that, I'll stop and see if there's some questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much for that. We do have a couple of questions. We have one from John Everett, and the question is, DC and Maryland do not have attorney-led voir dire, and they have upcoming trials. It says that the judges are conducting virtual jury selection before the trial. We see this as an opportunity to make inroads on attorney voir dire. Can you provide data or talking points to use with the judges for increased attorney involvement in the jury selection process?
Great question, John. Two quick points, and then I would say, please, let's talk. Write me, and I'll give you more. But here's the bottom line. One is I think I would view this as an opportunity to tell judges to use questionnaires. We're seeing even very sort of hard-headed judges welcome questionnaires, because the selling point is, judge, if you allowed us to do a questionnaire, the defense can put in what they want, we'll put in what we want. You don't need to do a lot of review of it, judge. And it'll happen outside of court, so we're being responsible and we're not putting jurors in the room more than we need to or in front of you, judge. The second is the paper I mentioned really early on has 2,500 people, 2,500 jurors across 3 civil cases. It's academically robust. It's worked on by some of the best, and I'm not including myself in this list, but by some great jury researchers at respected institutions. And it suggests that in all settings, if you only have minimal voir dire, you do not identify deep-rooted biases that hurt both sides. And I think the pitch would be, judge, we need at least some opportunity to ask about basic views of civil lawsuits and this case. And I'm not going to oppose the defense excluding jurors who say, I'd always vote for the plaintiff. And I don't think the defense should oppose me excluding jurors who say I'd always vote for the defense or who express deep biases, because you can't cure those, judge. And all we want is a jury down the middle. And I think we have good data to show that that is required to meet the standard of an impartial jury. And I think you would be able to say now, as we've talked about, given that COVID's going to skew the panel even more, judge, we really need to do some real meaningful questioning, or else, here's the threat, I think. If that doesn't happen, judge, and there's a skew, will this verdict hold up on appeal for whoever wins it, right? And judge, none of us want to try this case twice. And under COVID, I think we need to have more guarantees that we picked a fair jury, and that involves letting me talk to these jurors and letting the other side do that too.
A couple more questions. I know we're running out of time, but can you talk a little bit about some of the major trends that you were seeing pre-COVID that may be misconceptions, whether it's about race, gender, kind of the big things that I think we were all kind of taught about who the perfect juror is for a case?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is you and I have talked about this, Avery, is that there's, we were all trained to sort of profile jurors, I think, to some degree. And it was the best we had. But I can tell you that we often include in our report something that says, warning, these things don't matter. Because we have to tell attorneys, hey, in this case, race doesn't matter. We looked, and if we put a room full of this race, that race, and the other, and we separated them out and said, what percentage of the time do they vote for the plaintiff and how much money do they give? There's no statistical difference. So forget it. We often say age doesn't matter in this case, or age does. Gender matters or it doesn't. Whether they're blue collar or not matters or it doesn't. Their education matters or it doesn't. What I would tell you is it's far more case specific than most of us suspected. So just a quick example. Imagine a case that's identical on the facts. Let's call it a police excessive force case. But the person that was hurt by the police is an 18-year-old black girl or a 65-year-old white man who's a doctor. Let's just go like really different directions in how jurors might perceive those people. Now, what I would tell you, having done 2 cases very much like that, is which jurors you need to seat is almost inverted in those 2 cases. And so the idea that there's sort of a Rosetta Stone for seating jurors is not true. We have run cases where we've told people seat Trump supporters and conservative jurors. We've run other cases where we said, whatever you do, don't seat Trump supporters and conservative jurors. All right. And so what really moves the needle here are the facts. And the idea that we can sort of rely on intuition, I think is dangerous and sometimes leads us in bad directions.
One more question, and then I think I'll leave it to Mary, but can you talk just a little bit about, has the other side been conducting studies like this? Big insurance companies, have they been doing this whole time and we maybe just weren't aware that they had been doing robust studies?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think none of us know the full extent of the answer, but here's what I will say. I'll give 2 quick things. One is there's a firm in Denver where we're based that now has 3 PhDs on staff and advertises the fact that it does empirical studies for its clients. Right now, they're using that as a way to get business from other defense firms, but they're clearly doing the work. And so I can tell you, I know that there are some firms that are staffing up with social scientists, economists, and PhDs to do the work. The other thing I'll tell you is I helped pick a jury in Phoenix probably 6 months ago, or no, it was more than that, 9 or 10 months ago now, before COVID. And the defense, it was very clear to me. I knew one of the jury consultants by name, sort of by reputation, and I knew they did data work. And I knew another professor who got involved. And what became clear to me is that they did not use voir dire to pick their jury. They already knew which jurors they were going to seat between a combination of data analysis and deep dive background research on those jurors. And so that's my long way to say, yes, I used to say we're going to have an asymmetric advantage. I regret to say that I think in the next 2 or 3 years that won't be true. I think what it will mean is if you don't have good data on your cases, you might be behind.
Good to know. We all need to start doing it.
Uh-oh, I think Mary's talking about it here.
Yeah.
There she is.
I figured out how to unmute myself. Thank you so much, John. That was so fascinating. I'm sure we could have listened to you talk for another hour about this data that really needs to be considered. And I love the idea of using it to move the cases forward that will not be going to trial. It gives a bargaining chip, which I know a lot of the people on this call were interested in. So I do appreciate your time so much. I want to give a thank you to you for your time.